Hour Zero. Sitting in his office surrounded by his most trusted advisors, Xi Jinping feels ready. Over the past decade or more, he's spent billions upon billions modernizing China's military. His nation now has nuclear weapons, around 500 of them, and he's built one of the world's largest navies. Add to that the fact that China's military has more active members than any other nation, with 2.35 million people to call on. He's going to bring war to the United States. But to do so, he has to carefully coordinate attacks throughout the Pacific. He knows that the United States has bases in Japan and South Korea, around 190 in those two countries alone, and a powerful navy that, though smaller than his, packs a lot more firepower. A full frontal assault on the United States without taking care of those problems first would be suicide. He needs to secure the Pacific, giving China a route toward the American mainland as a priority. His attack doesn't begin with missile launches. It starts on the cyber front. For years, China has been working on cyber technology that would allow it to hack into American infrastructure and military defense systems, limiting America's response to an attack in the process. On occasion, China gets caught out. In December 2023, for instance, the United States conducted an operation to disrupt a network of small office home office or SOHO routers that China had taken control of using the KV botnet to mask its hacking activities. That was unfortunate for Xi, but it won't stop the first stage of his attack. Xi gives the okay and dozens of cyber attacks begin. Chinese hackers work feverishly, targeting American water systems, electrical grids, and communication systems, with a special focus on any that are located near key military installations. Further attacks take place within the networks of companies that provide critical services to America's military, as well as attacks on systems and transportation methods that will be used by the United States to deliver aid to Taiwan in the case of a Chinese invasion. That last step is critical. To reach the United States, China has to secure a passage through the Pacific. Taiwan, which China has claimed for decades should be part of the People's Republic anyway, is chosen as the main target. By securing that island, China can break through the nations in the Pacific that are allied to the United States, including Japan and South Korea, and clear its route to the American mainland. Hour 1. The United States is scrambling. It's no stranger to Chinese hackers, but it's never faced an operation of this scale before. The country's success against Volt Typhoon, the elite group of Chinese hackers that were responsible for the KV botnet attacks mentioned earlier, revealed that China has its fingers in major networks. Rail, mass transit, maritime, water, and pipeline systems were all under threat. And though Volt Tycoon has been mostly eradicated, the sheer scale of the disruption occurring in the US reveals that it was far from the only hacker group China had in play. America is left chasing shadows, at least for a couple of hours, which is all China needs to start the next stage of its assault. Xi Jinping gives the okay for the next and boldest part of its strategy: activating the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, or PLARF. The group has around 120,000 members, who combine to operate 6 known ballistic missile bases throughout China. However, the PLARF's real strength lies in the sheer number of missiles it has at its disposal. Recent estimates from the US Naval Institute place the number at somewhere around 4,000, all of which are capable of targeting ships moving at sea in addition to static land-based targets. Both capabilities will be needed by Xi. In arranging this attack, he's had to make some difficult decisions. He knew that a launch against Taiwan was inevitable, and the island nation became his first target. A missile barrage begins, with air support being provided by the recently upgraded bases at Longqian, Jiangsu, and Wuhan. All three are supporting China with fleets of Shenyang J-16 fighters, launching missiles of their own while engaging Taiwanese defenses in the air. The tougher attacks focus on the US Pacific Fleet. Numbering around 200 ships, along with 1,500 aircraft and 150,000 military personnel, that fleet is the biggest barrier that stands in the way of Xi's ambitions to invade the United States. It covers almost half of the world's surface, stretching from Antarctica to the Arctic Circle, taking in the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean in the process. Xi can't hit everything in that fleet, but his goal is to strategically weaken the fleet in the early hours of his new war, eliminating America's ability to rapidly respond to his actions. To do that, he needs a 3-pronged missile attack. First, he has to engage the naval bases the United States has set up in Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. It's a risky move. Any missile strike on these nations will surely cause collateral damage, potentially bringing all 3 of them into the war in support of the US. But failure to strike now means leaving nearly 200 bases ready to launch an immediate counterattack supported by around 79,000 troops. Xi can't take that risk. Hordes of Dongfeng 26 or DF-26 missiles are launched towards America's bases in Japan and South Korea. Each missile has a range of 2,485 miles, easily ensuring they can reach their targets. They are accompanied by shorter-range missiles, such as the DF-16, for a simple reason. Xi needs his DF-26s for attacks further afield. Those very missiles are also part of the second part of China's missile barrage, attacking closer to the United States. More are sent flying toward Guam, targeting the Andersen Air Force Base in Yago, as well as Naval Base Guam in Santa Rita. Xi also unleashes the new jewel in China's missile crown to strike Hawaii. The DF-27 is a hypersonic missile that can just about reach America's east coast and is capable of evading US missile defenses. It'll be Xi's chief weapon when attacking the American mainland, at least during the early stages of the war. Finally, the third strike, attacking American ships that are currently in the Pacific. Chief among the targets will be the small fleet of cruisers America has in the water near China, including the USS Shiloh and USS Mobile Bay. All told, there are 9 of these ships, all packed with heavy armaments and strong anti-air defenses that China hopes to either eliminate or damage heavily. Secondary targets include the much larger fleet of US Navy destroyers, which pack less of a punch than the country's cruisers but will still be enough to cause serious damage to the Chinese fleet if they're allowed to go unchecked. There are dozens to target, and Xi knows that he won't be able to take out all of them. But the more he can destroy with missiles now, the easier he'll find his invasion of Taiwan and subsequent passage to America. However, Xi's missiles won't have clear paths to their target. Though his cyber attacks have left the United States scrambling, it hasn't shut down the country's missile defense systems. America's DSP satellites, overseen by its Space Force, easily detect China's missile launches, giving President Joe Biden time to organize the country's defenses. Chief among these will be its ground-based interceptors, or GBIs, of which there are currently 44 active in the United States. Most of these systems, 40, are stationed in Alaska, though they're still capable of destroying intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, traveling at around 15,000 miles per hour. The other 4 are stationed in California, much closer to China's Hawaiian targets, and will be responsible for providing most of America's defenses against China's missile barrage. There's just one problem. What if any of the missiles contain nuclear warheads? Biden consults his advisors, who conclude that possibility is unlikely. American satellites show that the missiles are on course to hit its Pacific bases and Hawaii, suggesting a conventional strike. If Xi were going nuclear, his ICBMs would be on their way to Washington and other key strategic locations in the American mainland. Right now, the strategy is clear: evacuate troops from the anticipated strike zones and hunker down. A counterattack will come, but at present, the US has to rely on its missile defense systems. Across the Pacific, Xi watches and waits as the first of his missile barrages travel toward their targets in Japan and South Korea. Both have activated their missile defense systems to guard America's bases, with the platform they rolled out alongside the US toward the end of 2023, giving them advance notice of the missiles China has launched. Many get shot out of the sky, falling harmlessly into the Pacific, but the sheer number of Chinese missiles overwhelms the defenses. Okinawa is practically destroyed. As home to most of America's overseas military in Japan, it was the chief target of these strikes. At the Kadena Air Base, missiles rained down on F-15 Eagle fighters, E-3 Sentry planes, and KC-135 Stratotankers. The latter are especially important targets. They'll limit America's ability to refuel its aircraft in the air, restricting them to using the bases that China is so steadfastly attacking. The strike could be considered a success, killing thousands of American troops in the process. But Xi knows the bases aren't fully out of commission. He can't launch a ground-based invasion just yet, meaning the surviving crews at these bases will be able to rebuild quickly enough to continue to serve as launching points for the US Air Force. That's okay. He only needs them down for a few days. More missiles make their way toward cruisers and destroyers that the US has stationed in the Pacific. These ships are a little harder to strike, not least because they're not remaining still. Orders from American command have told all to start moving in erratic patterns, hoping to send Chinese missiles off course in the process. The tactic works in some cases, though not in others. China is successful in cutting down about half of America's cruisers, as well as several dozen destroyers. Again, a qualified success for Xi. A few minutes later, China's DF-27 and DF-26 missiles are drawing nearer to Hawaii. Dozens are shot out of the sky by California's missile defense systems, but they can't provide complete coverage. Many more break through, striking ships including the USS Frank E. Peterson and USS Hopper. Xi had hoped his strike would also take out at least some of the 13 submarines stationed in Hawaii, but no such luck. Even with his cyber attacks wreaking havoc, the commanders and crews of those submarines received orders to submerge underwater, safe from the missile barrage, until the US was ready to fight back. By the end of the first few hours of the conflict, China has expended nearly a quarter of its 4,000 missiles. It has wreaked devastation on the American bases in Asia, though at the cost of drawing Japan and South Korea into Xi's war. America's Pacific Fleet has been severely weakened, with Xi's cyber attacks also limiting the speed in which the US can respond to what he's going to do next. The strike's success wasn't total, but it was enough. Day 2. Having bought himself some time with his attack on the United States, leaving his main enemy in a temporary state of disarray, Xi can focus on his immediate target, Taiwan. China has spent the last day battering Taiwan with short-range missiles. The barrage has been successful in taking out several targets, including the smaller islands surrounding Taiwan, but it's also faced a steadfast defense from the US-made Patriot air defense system stationed on the island, as well as Taiwan's own Skybow surface-to-air ballistic missile defense systems. Still, the barrage will have to end soon, if only because Xi wants to send ground troops in to take the island. He can't risk killing his own people in friendly fire situations. After a 24-hour bombardment in which China expends hundreds of missiles, Xi assesses the damage he's caused. Crucially, his attacks on America's overseas bases, as well as America itself, will delay its navy in reaching the Taiwan Strait, and the missiles he's fired at Taiwan have severely weakened its naval defenses, while fighter planes from Longqian, Jiangsu, and Huan keep the country's air force occupied. He feels ready to start landing troops on the Taiwanese mainland, but therein he finds a problem. His landing options are limited. That's partially due to the actions of Taiwan's president, Tsai Ing-wen. She's been preparing for an attack from China for several months, especially in the wake of Beijing growing bolder by conducting military and naval operations in the Taiwan Strait. As soon as the missiles started flying, Tsai sent orders to defensive positions on both sides of the island. To the east, Taiwan benefits from having an extensive network of cliffs. Tsai anticipates that Xi will look to blockade that side of the island with his navy, but is unlikely to launch a full invasion from the east. Still, soldiers are placed on alert, telling them to prepare to fight against ground troops that might try to climb the cliffs, which have gradients of at least 15%. If need be, those troops will receive orders to destroy the routes built through the cliffs that lead to the mainland. Her main focus lies in Taiwan's west. As the coast closest to China, it's going to be the point of ingress into the island. Tsai places all 15 major ports and harbors on that coast on high alert, with orders for their destruction in place if China's forces get near. Tsai can't afford to allow China to set up a naval presence on the island itself if it manages to invade. Then there are Taiwan's beaches. All are heavily fortified, with any Chinese troops that manage to land having to make their way through scores of barbed wire-laden defenses just to achieve any hope of reaching the roads that lead to Taipei. The waters leading to most of those beaches are less than 50 feet deep, meaning China can't land troops en masse. It must take them most of the way before ferrying them across in smaller vessels, all while being subjected to missile fire from Taiwan. Those waters are also packed with shallow mines, with the beaches also containing anti-landing spikes that will prevent China's tanks from making inroads. And if worst comes to worst, Tsai can collapse the roads leading into Taipei from the west, forcing Chinese troops to navigate challenging terrain if they ever hope to reach Taiwan's capital. Tsai is going to make this a war of attrition, and that spells bad news for Xi. Day 3. The United States is almost ready to counter the initial Chinese offensive. But before it does, Biden puts on his diplomatic hat as he prepares to exploit a key weakness in Xi's plan. One of China's biggest challenges in the war is economic. The country relies heavily on importing goods, spending $2.56 trillion in 2023 alone. Biden has spent the last 3 days organizing heavy sanctions against China, with America's network of allies finally paying off. China will not only struggle to import goods and equipment from the United States, but it'll also be cut off from its European trade partners. All agree to not sell to or buy from China, essentially creating a blockade for as long as the war lasts. That blockade extends to oil. China imports 11.8 million barrels of oil per day to keep itself running. Much of that oil comes from Russia, which is now responsible for about 19% of the oil China buys annually. However, the other 81% comes from countries like Saudi Arabia, which are allied to the United States. Leveraging diplomatic pressure, as well as the concerns that other Asian nations such as Saudi Arabia have related to Chinese expansion, Biden is able to cut off most of the oil reaching China. Yes, Russia will supply Xi, though it isn't able to cover the massive shortfall that results from America's sanctions. And given Putin's war in Ukraine, he also can't risk Russia's trade with other countries for the sake of solely supporting China, especially given that he faces his own sanctions. Xi didn't expect this. Now he faces a shutdown. China has to defeat the United States in a matter of months, or else its resources will dwindle to the point where it's practically starved out of the fight that it started. Day 4. With sanctions in place and trade routes in the process of being cut off, Biden's next move is to speak to his allies in NATO. After all, China directly attacked America on its own soil by launching missiles at Hawaii. It also attacked America-owned military bases overseas, which would also constitute an attack on the US. All of this plays in Biden's favor for one reason: Article 5 of the NATO Charter. According to this article, if any NATO ally or member nation is the victim of an armed attack by another country, every other NATO member will consider this an act of violence against themselves. In short, China's attack on the United States has brought most of Europe into the fold. Biden has been cooperating with NATO members from the moment he detected China's missiles. Collectively, that makes him ready to utilize the power of 31 nations, including what's left of the United States defenses. The focal point of the counterattack is obvious: the Taiwan Strait. Xi has failed to take Taiwan with his missile barrage and now faces an extended conflict in which he's losing thousands of troops every day to his attempts to land on Taiwanese beaches. Even if he manages to break through Taiwan's defenses by simply throwing sheer numbers at the island, his troops will face an urban warfare campaign that will see them fight tooth and nail for every street they manage to claim. Xi didn't expect this. And this war of attrition all adds up to time that the US and its allies can take to prepare an attack. The strategy is to combine America's naval resources with those of its NATO allies, as well as the navies of South Korea, Japan, and Australia. The latter will also be a focal point of the counterattack, as China neglected to destroy the bases America has set up in Australia. The United States sends a fleet of ships, including most of its stock of 11 aircraft carriers, toward the Taiwan Strait. They're accompanied by one of the UK's aircraft carriers, the HMS Queen Elizabeth, loaded with Typhoon FGR-4 and F-35B Lightning jets. Similar support comes from Canada, which commits half of its 12 frigates to the American cause, as well as Japan, which sends most of its fleet of 36 destroyers. South Korea hesitates. It's happy to support the US in any way that it can, but it also has to be wary of North Korea, which could see China's attack as an opportunity for it to start a war with its southern neighbor. If South Korea commits its naval or aerial resources to America now, it leaves itself open to attack. Biden understands this, resulting in South Korea's role being to keep watch over North Korea to ensure it doesn't get involved in the conflict. And now the US has an allied fighting force that's capable of fighting against China in the sea or air. The fleet sets sail. Week 2. Xi has been bombarding Taiwan to no avail. Every attempt to land ground troops on Taiwan's beaches is met with missile strikes and fierce beach combat. Yes, he's slowly whittling away at those defenses, but for each victory he achieves, a road is destroyed or a tunnel collapsed by Taiwan, forcing his troops to divert over difficult terrain to get to Taipei. The few who managed to reach Taiwan's capital have been destroyed in urban warfare. This was supposed to be a quick victory. It had to be. Every day that China doesn't control Taiwan is another day in which American counteroffensives draw nearer. Finally, 2 weeks after his missile launches, Xi faces the prospect of American naval and aerial assets reaching the Taiwan Strait. Worse yet, they're supported by NATO and Japan, neither of which wants to see China gain more influence, be it in the Pacific or the Americas. Worse yet for China, its navy, though larger than America's, doesn't compare in terms of sheer firepower. Though Xi was successful in destroying almost 24 of America's destroyers in his missile barrage, that still leaves 68 to contend with, around 20 more than China has. And although China has more corvettes and patrol boats, neither will withstand the combined naval firepower being brought into the Taiwan Strait. Worse yet for Xi, America has an ace in the hole: its Rapid Dragon tactic. Over the past couple of years, the United States has been retrofitting some of its cargo aircraft so they're capable of dropping pallets of long-range missiles. Each pallet can be stocked up with 30 AGM-158 JASSM cruise missiles, which have a range of between 229 and 1,118 miles, depending on which version of the missile is launched. Stacked into America's MC-130J aircraft, which Xi didn't target as he didn't believe them to be a threat, these pallets start raining cruise missiles down onto the Taiwan Strait. Those missiles serve two purposes. If they hit a Chinese ship, their 990-pound WDU-42B penetrator warheads can easily destroy most targets. But even if they fail to hit, such a large barrage of missiles launched simultaneously will confuse the missile defense systems built into China's larger warships, as well as those in the 3 air bases that are the launching point for China's fighter jets. While the missile defenses are focused on a flurry of JASSM cruise missiles, more targeted strikes can take out targets. The Allied forces turn the tide in the Taiwan Strait. Month 2. Xi has lost the clear passage into Taiwan that he'd established during his initial invasion. He's still getting troops onto the mainland, though each landing is subjected to Taiwanese defenses along with assaults from the US and its allies' navies. Worse yet, he's lost air superiority. In truth, he never really had it. Taiwan's 142 F-16 fighter jets, many of which have been upgraded, may be technologically inferior to China's J-20s. The Infrared Search and Track, or IRST, built into the J-20s means that it's far more capable of tracking and eliminating a target than the F-16. But Tsai knew this, and knew that support was coming from the US. She's used her F-16s to delay rather than defeat China, just as she's used her beach and urban warfare tactics to keep China from sending hundreds of thousands of troops into Taipei. Now, the US and NATO are in the Taiwan Strait, and they're pushing Chinese forces back to their home country. Constant missile barrages on the Longqian, Jiangsu, and Huan air bases have rendered them practically unusable, making it a struggle for China to get new fighters into the air as quickly as it had managed before. America's aircraft carriers, of which it brings 8 to the Taiwan Strait, can each hold around 75 fighters, bringing the Allied forces to a total of 600 when at full capacity. Add to that the Rapid Dragon strategy, and America and its allies are shutting down every attack China attempts. It's not long before America's Navy cuts off the passage into Taiwan. Cut off from their target, China's naval and air forces begin a retreat, leaving the few thousand Chinese troops still in Taiwan stranded. They'll be picked off by Taiwan's forces in Taipei, assuming they get there. And with the US now firmly entrenched in the Taiwan Strait, it's able to land troops on the island's beaches to attack the remnants of China's forces from the rear. It's a lethal pincer movement that soon puts paid to Xi's invasion. Still, it hasn't all been clear sailing for the US. China has managed to use its strong submarine fleet, with its 6 Shang-class nuclear submarines leading the way, to take out 2 of America's aircraft carriers. It's a difficult loss, especially given that those carriers housed about 150 fighters between them. But America's submarines are just as lethal. Though it has fewer submarines than China, around 60 to China's 78, its crews are better trained and have fewer targets to strike. Both of China's aircraft carriers, brought into the conflict due to the American assaults on its air bases, are taken out, minimizing China's impact from the air. Xi has to face a very real possibility. He's about to lose this war. Month 3. China has stubbornly refused to give in to the overwhelming force being applied to it. The country's navy lies in tatters, with only a fleet of patrol boats guarding its coast to back the few corvettes and frigates it has left. Xi has called his ships back, anticipating an invasion by the United States into the Chinese mainland. Xi has failed to take Taiwan. And in attacking the United States directly, he's only discovered that America's NATO allies take Article 5 very seriously. The same goes for other allies, including Japan and South Korea, which have aided the US both because of their military alliances with the country and because neither wants to see the spread of Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific. Xi knows he's miscalculated. Now he faces a very big question. Does he launch nuclear weapons? China has around 500 nukes, as well as ICBMs, capable of reaching the continental United States. His country's CSS-4 Mod 2 Mod 3 missiles could do the job thanks to their 8,000-mile range. The DF-41 can also hit the mark, as it's capable of traveling nearly 7,500 miles. But Xi thinks better of it. Launching his nuclear weapons against the United States would mean a response in kind. and while America's Minuteman III ICBMs lack the range of his missiles, the country's submarines and aerial bombers could easily drop nukes all over China if provoked. Ultimately, China is forced to capitulate, though its military would prove a strong match for the United States alone and could even have the potential to defeat its American counterpart. It simply can't stand up to such a powerful united front. Taiwan proved stronger than Xi expected, with his failed invasion meaning plans to reach the American mainland never got off the ground. And with most of Europe, thanks to NATO, gunning for him, he can't escape the fact that he's been overwhelmed. Add to all of this the effects of the sanctions and trade blockades America created within days of him starting his war. They've slowly sapped the morale of the Chinese people, resulting in them being ready for surrender. America wins the war, but it's a win that came at a cost. It will take the US years to rebuild its war-torn navy, and along with its NATO allies, it will be heavily involved in imposing military restrictions on China for years to come. However, it's proven the impact that its cooperative approach to defense can have in a battle against one of its greatest rivals, putting any other major military power that might dare to attack the US on notice in the process. Of course, this is just one of many potential scenarios that could play out if China and the US went to war. It's also optimistic in favor of the US. But what could China do to prevent this series of events from happening? Would they happen at all, or do you think the US may struggle to receive the support it needs from NATO and its allies in Asia? Tell us what you think in the comments below. Now go and check out the US Navy's plan to defeat China in war, or click this other video instead. A war between Russia and NATO might seem impossible. After all, NATO currently consists of 32 member countries, including the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and most of Europe. Collectively, NATO forces dwarf those of Russia, both in terms of quantity and quality. So how could a NATO-Russia war possibly come to pass? Well, as uncomfortable as it might be to consider, there are a few possibilities. For example, as very nearly came to pass in the 1980s, what if a NATO wargame was misinterpreted by Russian intelligence as cover for an assault on the motherland, leading to a preemptive strike? What if Russia decided to invade a smaller member state on its border, pushing the red lines and seeing if NATO, most importantly the US, responded? The history between Russia and NATO has long been tense. Despite a brief thaw after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, these tensions are back at a deep freeze. In fact, relations are arguably the worst they've been for half a century. Some have even said we're in a new Cold War. Join us as we delve into this hypothetical matchup and scenario, which aims to illustrate one key point: the US's involvement and leadership are critical. Without it, who knows what might happen. Hour 0. After years of planning, Putin's generals give the go-ahead. They want a much further divide between Russia's borders and NATO countries. Their target? Lithuania and the Baltic states. Taking Lithuania cuts Latvia and Estonia off from Europe, leaving them primed and ready for a further Russian advance. It's not just a territorial expanse, though. The Russians feel utterly betrayed by NATO and the US in particular. As the Soviet Union collapsed, NATO officials had indicated, but not in any legally binding manner, that NATO would avoid further eastward expansion, ensuring the new Russia didn't feel vulnerable. But it had reneged on that promise, and Russia was, and still is, deeply angry. Any potential trust was dead in the water as soon as any countries bordering Russia joined NATO, leading to the inevitable re-escalation of tension and the potential for a new cold or hot war. The ongoing war in Ukraine hasn't gone as planned. As of early mid-2024, Russian armed forces have taken a beating, with only around 1,750 tanks left in operational service, and that includes a few antiques. It has around 1,200 bombers, fighters, and attack aircraft left. But Russia must never be underestimated. Its infantry is even larger than in 2022 at the start of the Ukraine war, and despite significant equipment and vehicle losses, the production chain is ramping up. And close relations with allies like China and Iran mean more and more piling into the inventory every day. After months of testing and probing, including airspace and naval violations, as well as amassing troops on the border, Russia has seen little military response from Lithuania's NATO allies. Western leaders have verbally condemned Russia's thinly veiled threats, yet nobody has sent missiles, ships, jets, or reinforcements to their small ally. Okay, hour 0 rolls around. Judgment time. It's the middle of the night. The few hundred tanks Russia has left, removed from the war in Ukraine, are lined up on Lithuania's border. They fire up their engines and, escorted by 100,000 troops, mostly newly conscripted, approach the crossings. Simultaneously, GPS and radar jamming cripples Lithuanian navigation and communication systems, protecting the Russian soldiers and armaments from most missiles. Russia launches a barrage of thousands of sea and air-launched missiles along with Iranian-built drones, first using its weaker, cheaper, and more disposable subsonic models. Lithuania has very few air defense units, and NATO hasn't finished ratifying the deal that will see the country host its more advanced launchers. The country's aerial defenses will be swiftly overwhelmed, at which point the supersonic and hypersonic arsenal will come into play. Simultaneously, Russia launches its spare 4th and 5th generation fighter jets, including older Sukhoi 27s and MiG-29s, as well as their newer counterparts, the Su-30, Su-35s, and a couple of brand new Su-57s. The Lithuanian Air Force, the LTAF, has no chance. No matter how excellent their training is, the numbers are overwhelming. Their 6 or so active aircraft are mostly helicopters and transport planes, no match for modern multi-purpose jets. Although the long-range radar stations in the east of the country see the Russians coming a mile off, there's nothing they can do. The jets are on top of them almost immediately, heading straight for the LTAF airbase in Šiauliai. Russia has 2 primary goals and 2 secondary objectives. First, it seeks to take Vilnius, the Lithuanian capital, near its border, before NATO can respond. Second, it will aim to seize land between Belarus and Poland, slowing NATO land defenses. Then, if it can conquer all 3 Baltic states without triggering nuclear war, it will have significant access to the Baltic and a much greater barrier between itself and NATO advances. And finally, even if it all comes to naught, Putin will learn an awful lot about how NATO conducts war. Lithuania's intelligence division, the VSD, has expected this move for some time. After all, why else would an openly threatening country line its troops up on the border? However, Lithuania's pleas for assistance to NATO allies have previously been swept under the rug. Nobody else believed Russia would start another war, especially considering its ongoing losses in Ukraine. How wrong they were. Hour 1. The attack has been strategically timed. Almost all NATO leaders around the world are asleep or preparing for bed. Only the American president and Canadian prime minister are still awake, but they're enjoying rare peaceful evenings with their families. But intelligence operatives are wide awake. All around the world, NATO leaders are urgently roused from their slumber and immediately summoned to high-security meetings. They're informed of Russia's invasion. The British Prime Minister, French President, and German Chancellor sleepily try to grasp the severity of the situation. At the same time, their 2 North American counterparts hold their heads in their hands. The world is on the brink of war, and Article 5 of the NATO agreement forces their retaliation, along with 26 other countries, and of course, Lithuania itself. But legal obligations aside, is an aggressive retaliation a plausible response? Will it save lives? Or most crucially of all, will it risk triggering an all-out nuclear war, mutually assured destruction of all major powers, and millions of unnecessary casualties? The NATO Response Force, the NRF, and its 40,000 troops are primed and ready to respond. They've been training for this and know that NATO can quickly mobilize a further 300,000 soldiers, with millions more prepared to be called up. But it needs the go-ahead. It can't act without authorization from the top. And the NATO leaders have a dilemma. NATO was implemented to deter Soviet expansion and aggression, seeking to prevent conflict. Now that war has started anyway, they face an unprecedented situation. How should they respond? Hour 2. NATO negotiators immediately try to open communication channels with the Kremlin. They're deeply concerned about the risk of worldwide nuclear war and outright destruction, but nobody answers. And because nobody answers, NATO leaders are at a loss for what to do. In fact, in Russia, Putin and his generals are purposefully ignoring the ringing red hotline, waiting to see how the West will respond. What move will they make? Until such time, they'll continue with the invasion as planned. Meanwhile, as dawn approaches, odd things start happening in industries throughout Lithuania and its Baltic state neighbors Estonia and Latvia. Breakers in power substations around the countries start mysteriously flipping off, bank networks go offline, port gates stop working, and strange messages appear on the phones of government officials and contractors. Before long, the vast majority of computers display nothing more than a black screen and a ransom message demanding Bitcoin payment. On the surface, it looks like an independent extortionist hacking group, but the strategic timing leaves few in doubt. Russia's elite hackers, such as the elusive GRU group known as Sandworm, are almost certainly behind the carnage. As Lithuanians wake up in a war, they find their heating and air conditioning systems offline. No matter, they've survived far more than the relatively mild discomfort caused by a spring attack on infrastructure like this. but they soon find it's far more than their systems. Most of the power remains out, preventing streetlights from working, electric cars from charging, and shops from opening. Even more dangerously, software helping the armed forces direct their personnel and organize strategic moves is utterly destroyed, along with all its backups. Its leaders and soldiers are resilient though, and they turn to less conventional methods to facilitate communication. These include WhatsApp communications through satellite Wi-Fi and even runners carrying notes to and fro. Hour 3. Lithuanian forces continue to engage the Russian onslaught, but there's very little they can do without NATO support. Brave soldiers take out Russians at a ratio of more than 5-1. Still, the relentless wave of humans and machinery just keeps coming. Eventually, the self-sacrificial defenders are forced to fall back or risk being overwhelmed and wiped out. Where are its allies? Where is NATO? NATO is deliberating. European leaders are by now wide awake and beginning to plan countermeasures. Despite the encroaching night, President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau in North America down strong coffees and continue to work. Here's the broader situation. Britain and France, two of the strongest European powers, have nuclear weapons of their own. Other countries, including Germany, Italy, and Belgium, have American nukes stationed within their borders. They're all poised and ready to fire them if necessary, but doing so would have catastrophic consequences. Despite Russia's significant losses of personnel and equipment in Ukraine and now Lithuania, it still maintains the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world, with 5,580 warheads as of 2024. Of these, 1,710 are deployed and ready to be launched on a missile or loaded onto a bomber at a moment's notice. The world's other nuclear superpower, the US, held 3,708 as of 2023, with 1,419 deployed. In contrast, the world's other nuclear powers hold relatively meager numbers. Again, in 2023, China had 410, the UK had 225, France held 290, Pakistan had 170, India 164, Israel 90, and North Korea about 30. While these numbers may pale in comparison, especially considering that most are likely not actively deployed, note that modern nuclear weapons are often 50 to 100 times more powerful than those dropped on Japan at the end of World War II. If just one hits its intended target, the damage would be unfathomable, too great for the human brain to even comprehend. That's why NATO is carefully considering its next move. Russia is unpredictable right now, testing the waters and seeing what it can get away with. It's looking for a fight, but it doesn't have a death wish. NATO leaders, and most importantly the US, must choose their play carefully. The discussions are tense and drag on. All the while, Lithuanian soldiers are being pushed further and further back, with ground forces entering the outskirts of Vilnius. The tragic deaths are mounting. Hour 4. NATO boffins have been working away at the Russian cyber attack, isolating and reverse engineering the malware. Whoever is behind it is a genius. The destructive code has been a ticking time bomb, isolating unknown weaknesses in Windows operating systems and using these to spread through local networks. At the invasion's preset date, which must have been in the minds of Russian military planners for months, the malware code ran, wiping all the data in its path. While the Baltic states aren't the only ones affected, the bulk of the operational damage is concentrated in these areas. With NATO's help, the Lithuanians bring some power systems back online. It was a temporary handicap, but one which was extremely costly. As Lithuanian forces fall back, their communication systems come back online. This, combined with the never-say-die attitude of its armed forces, turned the battle towards guerrilla tactics. This begins to have a devastating morale impact on Russian troops, who are seeing their comrades killed in huge numbers all around them. Like the Ukrainians, the Lithuanians use their knowledge of the terrain and their force of mind to slow the Russian advance, proving particularly effective against the old and cumbersome tanks. Meanwhile, relatively safe in their comfortable meeting places throughout Europe and North America, the US finally decides what to do. Its fellow member states agree and turn to the job at hand with grim determination. NATO will reinforce Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia with troops, tanks, aircraft, ships, submarines, missiles, and missile defense systems. The overwhelming number and the quality of the individual units and troops should prove more than a match for Russia. However, NATO allocates the US to contact the Russians, explaining in clear terms that nuclear weapons are not on the table. Not yet, anyway. With their forces already gathered and ready, NATO sends supplies, armaments, and response force troops to the Baltic states. Countries begin mobilizing their standing armies and calling volunteers to enlist. The European navies, notably Britain and France, aren't what they once were. They must wait for reinforcements from the Italians, while the far more extensive American fleet begins the journey to join them. In the meantime, the USS Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier, the final iteration of the nuclear-powered Nimitz-class vessels with its FA-18 Super Hornets and E-2 Hawkeyes, is already in the area, despite usually being part of Carrier Strike Group 5 operating in the Indo-Pacific. NATO can respond quickly. However, one question remains: will they reach the Lithuanians in time? Day 2. The fighting rages on all day before nighttime brings a brief reprieve for most. Special forces operations from Lithuania, NATO, and Russia continue to penetrate across the lines in both directions, springing devastating surprise attacks and assassinations, but the battle lines, just outside Vilnius, hold relatively steady. It's looking good for Lithuania. Despite fierce resistance, the Russian forces simply keep on coming. Although the NATO alliance is on the way, there's little it can do to keep the onslaught at bay. Its leaders consult what to do. They know that every second the fighting continues, more men and women will die. But with ships, aircraft, and vehicles steamrolling in to reinforce them, they just need to hold out a bit longer. The decision is made that the sacrifice of the country's brave soldiers is worth it. If Russia takes the capital, they might never see independence again. By the second day, most power companies are back online, their systems restored from obscure backups. There are still a few glitches and areas where administrators struggle to bring industries back from cyber destruction, but still, things look far more positive than the previous day. Buildings in Vilnius are being flattened, with civilian deaths mounting. Artillery and missile fire takes down critical infrastructure, including power stations, transformers, and even hospitals. The situation is dire. There's no support from the ground or the air. The tiny LTAF has been destroyed before it even left the asphalt. Meanwhile, NATO introduces even more official sanctions on Russia, hitting its economy hard. Without the vital trade, Russia notices the first signs of struggles. However, plenty more countries outside of NATO rely on Russian imports and exports, notably China, Iran, Belarus, and North Korea. Although their trade is significantly reduced and the stock markets take a hammering, Russian forces show no signs of slowing down. The Lithuanian armed forces are growing tired as the day draws to a close. Russian armaments continue to pour over the border in droves, missiles raining down. With the local missile defense systems completely overwhelmed, civilian deaths and infrastructure damage are rising exponentially. But as evening comes, the first signs of hope arrive. Fifth-generation jets land in neighboring Poland, ready to launch devastating counterattacks. Vehicle-borne missile launchers used for attack and defense arrive in neighboring countries and Lithuania. These immediately kick into action, significantly reducing the damage from the air and providing Russian jets and bombers with a substantially more complex adversary. Day 3. Throughout all this time, Russia has had a gaping hole, the Baltic Sea. With all of Scandinavia now in NATO, there are plenty of places from which Lithuania can be reinforced, and sea access to the country can be maintained. Russia's Baltic Sea fleet consists of only one traditional old Soviet submarine, Dimitrov. In fact, it's one of the oldest submarines in the entire Russian Navy. Despite about 2 frigates, 27 corvettes, and a few landing craft, the Baltic Sea fleet is hopelessly outdated and focused more on intelligence and troop movement than military might. Its one destroyer, the Sovremeny-class Nastoychevi, has been in repair since 2019. The Baltic Fleet simply hasn't been the priority next to, for example, the Black Sea Fleet or the Northern Fleet in the Arctic. At the start of the third day of the war, Russia contacts NATO. The combined fleets have reached distances at which they can engage. Heavy artillery begins raining down on Russian positions, and Russian naval bases in Kaliningrad are immediately overwhelmed. NATO naval forces are simply far greater in numbers and firepower. And it isn't just at sea that NATO begins to take the advantage, supporting its small member state. Missile launchers line up, keeping a significant distance from each other to ensure safety in isolation. Russian jets now have a considerable problem avoiding missiles from the advanced Patriot missile defense systems. Almost all Russian missiles are now being intercepted, and Lithuania and NATO begin counterstrikes on Russian-held positions and reinforcement points. NATO jets join in, pounding targets relentlessly. Russia's air defense systems are put to work, but as time passes, NATO missiles are being constantly resupplied, and fifth-generation fighters with enhanced missile evasion capabilities keep coming. Russia, on the other hand, has a limited supply of both missiles and jets, and it can't afford to significantly reduce its stock or needlessly expend its hypersonic missiles or fifth-generation fighters in case of a more impactful future conflict. It's time to talk. Negotiations begin. But in the meantime, the fighting continues. Putin is determined to learn as much about his enemy as he can. Likewise, NATO troops fight with renewed resolve for a free Lithuania. Although most NATO leaders are now confident in victory, they aren't sure yet when that will come around, nor the total cost of the war once arms are laid down. Week 2. As the war drags into its second week, the tide decisively turns in NATO's favor. Superior numbers and superior quality in those numbers mean that NATO armies have a massive advantage. F-35C aircraft from aircraft carriers dominate Russian-held positions, backed up by Europe's favored Eurofighter Typhoons. With footholds and FOBs established throughout Poland, Estonia, and Latvia, they pound Russian forces from the north and south, reinforcing in swarms. Naval bases in Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Denmark allow Allied ships to repeatedly dock, resupply, and come back at the trapped Russian forces, decimating their Baltic Sea fleet and honing in on Kaliningrad, Russia's main seaport. With the Danes controlling access to the Baltic Sea from the north, Russia has virtually no chance of breaking out. Their only hope is to surrender or fight alongside attacks on harbors or logistics chains. Fortunately for Russia, cyber attacks are its specialty. Government hackers launch a barrage of distributed denial of service and malware probes toward the Scandinavian-owned NATO ports. They have some initial success, with dock workers and sailors becoming confused and losing access to schedules and cargo information. This leads to long lines of ships stretching out into the sea, and these NATO vessels are vulnerable to attack. Russian missiles, jets, and their naval fleet turn to attack the ships and succeed in doing critical damage to a couple, but they're overwhelmed and forced to retreat by the hastily assembled escort warships. Cyber attacks can bring an immense temporary advantage. However, cybersecurity experts usually find a way to restore backed-up data or work around the malware within a few days, sometimes a few hours. In this case, NATO cybersecurity experts have the port systems back online and up to date in a few hours. It takes only a couple of days for the dock workers working overtime to get back on track. As Russia is pushed further and further back, things appear increasingly gloomy. Month 2. Russia begins to consolidate its forces. Putin knows he's not going to make any further progress against NATO and rallies all his troops back across the Russian border. But there's one last move in the book, and one that shakes Biden, Sunak, Scholz, Macron, Trudeau, and the rest of the NATO leaders to their core. Intelligence suggests that nuclear weapons are being prepped for launch in Kaliningrad and South Belarus. With no other option, NATO quickly decides it must act, preparing nuclear warhead-tipped Tomahawk missiles. Although Russia still has plenty of missiles, the invasion of Lithuania was never intended as a territorial expansion or a declaration of war on the rest of NATO. Russian leaders would never take such outrageous action, not without good reason to believe in their success at least. No, instead the Lithuanian invasion was always very likely to fail. It was always going to end up as a test, a sort of tragic live-fire exercise, a test of Russia's capabilities, an examination of how NATO would respond. Would nuclear weapons be on the table? Would the states get involved? Or would it refuse to risk escalating the conflict further? Russia hasn't gained any military ground or established any footholds. It will soon inevitably be forced to retreat, and yet that's what Putin and his leaders always expected would happen. In fact, they're fascinated by how the events have played out. NATO countries were far more willing to reinforce Lithuania than many in the war cabinet had imagined. Equally, the initial response from NATO was fraught with confusion, hesitation, and a hint of panic. Even as NATO missiles pound down, decimating their forces, Russia feels a gleam of satisfaction. It's learned a lot. It doesn't take long for the surrender and peace agreement to be reached, in which Russia promises never to invade again and pay for the damages sustained to Lithuania and the NATO forces. Putin and his government smile. They lost the battle, decidedly, but next time, things might be different. What do you think a war between NATO and Russia would look like? Who would come out on top and why? Let us know in the comments. Now go and check out if the US and China go to war, who loses hour by hour? Or click this other video instead. America is losing the war on drugs. The opioid crisis threatens the very fabric of US society. In the past 25 years, an estimated 800,000 lives have been lost, and millions of others ripped apart by a cycle of addiction, poverty, crime, and premature death. In an article with UK newspaper The Guardian from January 2024, Dr. Art Van Zee said, "It didn't have to happen. There were so many missed opportunities, so many times it could have been stopped. Now, I don't see how it ends." If the country doesn't take decisive action, many of the communities worst affected might never conceivably recover. In an unprecedented move, President Joe Biden has called an emergency meeting with his Secretary of Defense Lloyd J. Austin III and the heads of each branch of the military. Biden, like so many of his predecessors, knows exactly where these drugs are coming from and exactly who to target: Mexico and its infamous drug cartels. He knows he's reached the point of no retreat and that it's his responsibility to tackle the problem head-on, and that starts today. But why has the Biden administration decided to act now? Two reasons: fentanyl and China. In an interview back in May 2023, U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland called the Mexico-based Sinaloa cartel the largest, most violent, and most prolific fentanyl trafficking operation in the world. The drug itself, a synthetic opioid, is up to 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine, a truly chilling indication of exactly how deadly this drug can be. Various governmental agencies, including the Drug Enforcement Administration, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the military, have all tracked the cartel's supply chains and money laundering networks back to China. Even more troublingly, they've identified exactly where the ingredients to make one of the most addictive opioids on the planet have come from: the same country, China. However, an all-out assault on the Mexican drug cartels will be a tricky proposition to sell to both Congress and the American people. The economic ramifications alone could be disastrous. But when the president heard that fentanyl was being smuggled into the country disguised as candy, and that it could quite easily be mistaken as such by young children, he knew the time for talking had stopped. Hour 1. The meeting commences. The battle lines are drawn. Biden is in a prickly, confrontational mood. He paces up and down the Oval Office and informs Austin, General Charles Q. Brown Jr., Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Christopher W. Grady, Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Randy A. George, Chief of Staff of the Army, General Christopher J. Mahoney, Acting Commandant of the Marine Corps, and Admiral Lisa M. Franchetti, Chief of Naval Operations, of his plan of action. Folks, with your help, we're going to wreck the Mexican drug cartels once and for all. We're going to launch an attack so devastating and precise that we will shatter their operations completely. George is the first to express his surprise. Like the other top military officials in attendance, he presumed this was no more than a standard briefing. What do you mean exactly, Mr. President? Just what I said. We're going to strike at the drug cartels in their own backyards, and we're going to put them out of commission within the next 24 hours. The room becomes a hive of activity, argument, counter-argument, and hypotheses. But Biden has already put Port Huachuca, the nearest U.S. military base to the Mexican border, on high alert. Situated in Cochise County, Arizona, the complex has a population of about 6,500 active-duty soldiers. Only in recent weeks, that number has swelled exponentially, and the site has been the scene of top-secret military operations. Additional troops and military hardware have been covertly delivered to the base in preparation for a surprise attack on the drug cartels. Over the next 45 minutes, Biden and his team draw up a two-pronged attack. Firstly, the 4 biggest cartels will be targeted by systematic drone strikes. Not that this will be a wholly straightforward part of the mission. The drug-making and distribution facilities identified by U.S. intelligence are situated in different parts of the country, in some cases hundreds of kilometers apart. The Sinaloa cartel in the northwest, the Jalisco cartel, mainly in the Tierra Caliente region, the Gulf cartel in the northeast, centered around the border state of Tamaulipas, and the Los Zetas cartel, also in the same northeasterly region. But sir, says Randy, our drones don't have that kind of range to hit targets that far away from Huachuca. As a result, we'll never be able to coordinate the kind of synchronized attacks you talked about. That's when Biden reveals his ace card: the Mexican government. Since 2006, the country declared its own war on the cartels. 360,000 citizens have been victims of drug-related homicide. Despite partnering closely with the US, receiving billions of dollars to modernize its security forces, reform its judicial system, and fund development projects to curb migration, no real or lasting progress has been made. Ultimately, Washington hoped to stem the flow of illegal drugs into the country by bolstering security and monitoring operations along the border, but to no avail. Like his American counterpart, Mexican leader Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or AMLO as he's called in the popular press, knows that the time for empty rhetoric and procrastination is well and truly over. It's time to act. In maneuvers just as covert, Mexican military hardware and troops have been gathering in the northwest and northeast of the country. Unbeknown to the drug cartels, they are now under round-the-clock surveillance and are about to be subject to a devastating attack, the likes of which have rarely, if ever, been seen before. Secondly, and decisively, ground troops then swarm on each of the targeted cartel facilities to ensure that they have all been put out of operational use and that the key figures in the Mexican drug trade have either been killed or captured. We've done this before, the president says. Think Bin Laden in Pakistan. And don't kid yourselves in any way, shape or form. This operation is of similar importance to the American people. But sir, says Brown, much of the cartel infrastructure is based in cities or towns, built-up areas with a high concentration of civilians. Military action of this nature would result in a potentially huge loss of life, collateral damage that will be hard to justify, no matter how worthy the cause. Risky it might be, but Biden knows he has to bring down the Mexican drug cartels as quickly as he plans. Ultimately, it would give him the kind of political leverage that might just see him cling onto the keys of the White House in the upcoming elections. Make no mistake, Biden is staking his political legacy on the success of this operation. Let's proceed as planned. Let's do some good, people. Hour 2. Fort Huachuca has been put on a state of high alert. Personnel are now priming the Hellfire missiles on squadrons of drones, which will shortly be launched against the drug facilities within range. Each drone will be armed with the AGM-114 Hellfire Air-to-Surface Missile, ASM. Originally designed for anti-armor use, they were later developed for precision drone strikes against other target types, especially high-value targets, just like the drug manufacturing facilities in Mexico. This multi-mission, multi-target precision strike ability means that the missiles can be launched from multiple air, sea, and ground platforms, making Fort Huachuca the perfect location to initiate the surprise attack. To ensure optimal devastation, the drones will be launched in mini-squadrons of 20 in number. When in range, the laser-guided AGM-114L Longbow Hellfire missiles will be deployed. Nothing within the vicinity is likely to survive a direct hit. Hour 6. The first wave of drones is launched. In a series of well-coordinated attacks, the Hellfire missiles successfully target the drug cartel infrastructure, decimating dozens of buildings and reducing whole streets to nothing more than dust and rubble. Reports from Mexican troops on the ground paint a picture of utmost carnage and chaos. Whole neighborhoods have been leveled. Dead bodies are strewn across the blood-soaked streets. Fires rage, sirens wail. Not that there is much that the paramedics who arrive at the scene can do for those maimed and seriously injured. Reports of thousands of casualties from each town and city are starting to reach media outlets across Mexico and beyond. The attacks are devastating and effective. One cartel after another has been effectively wiped off the face of the earth. But at what cost? Like Brown had predicted back at the Oval Office, the cartels are far from stupid. They deliberately operate out of big cities and towns he mentioned in heavily built-up areas to nullify the possibility of such an attack. They know that no government could initiate a full-blown offensive if the loss of innocent lives would be so high. Biden has called their bluff. The sudden nature and ferociousness of the attacks have taken the cartels by surprise. For that reason, they have suffered irrecoverable losses, both in terms of manpower, infrastructure, and product. While the drug manufacturing facilities may have been primitive, they were incredibly effective, with some working around the clock. Billions of dollars of refined opioids destined for the American market have been destroyed. Great chemical clouds of smoke hang over the site of each decimated building. Visibility is negligible, and the air is barely breathable. Round 1 to Biden and the Mexican government. Hour 12. Heavy artillery moves in on the ground. Mexican AMX-13, T-55 and T-72 tanks and hundreds of troops, ably supported by US Rangers, Green Berets, Marine or Delta Force regiments, aim to secure each targeted area and ensure that any hostile threat has been neutralized. At first, this appeared to be no more than a reconnaissance mission, with troops confirming that different sectors of different towns and cities were safe and reporting back to their superiors, but that didn't prove to be the case. As each unit picked its way through the rubble, they met with incredible and unforeseen resistance. Although fully unprepared for the attack, the surviving cartel members have somehow managed to galvanize themselves into a scattered fighting force. Equipped with armored trucks with 50 caliber machine guns and their own grenade-dropping drones, the severely depleted forces scramble to launch wave after wave of attack. As a result, the Mexican and US troops have to dig in and take defensive positions. With far superior manpower and resources, they see this as the only momentary setback and fully expect to continue their advance in due course. However, as US snipers get into position and begin to return fire, they soon realize that they are shooting at no more than heavily armed children. "Sir," one of the commanding officers reports back to base, "we have a slight problem on the ground here and need some clarification from our superiors before proceeding with the mission." For the drug cartels, no tactic, however preposterous or underhand, is off the table. They have routinely used child soldiers as young as 11 to further their operational goals. Whether patrolling the drug-making facilities or intimidating the local populace, kids who should rightly have been playing in parks are now toting semi-automatic weapons and tossing grenades at one of the most advanced armies in the world. The killing of children, even in a war against drugs, wouldn't look good for Biden in an election year. When the president is made aware of the fact in the White House Situation Room, he sits in studied silence for a full minute, maybe more. He no doubt visualizes the headlines in the morning papers and hears the bulletins on all the major news channels, but he's gone too far to pull out now. Ever since he took office, he's read one report after another enumerating the drug-related deaths directly attributable to the Mexican cartels. He knows it's a cliché, and he knows that it may well not save his job, but in some situations, tough decisions simply have to be made. In some situations, as inhumane as it may sound, the ends really do justify the means. Continue with the mission, he informs his staff. Let's get this thing done and dusted today. Hour 18. Having slowly but surely overcome the fierce resistance on the ground, Mexican and US troops have now secured each and every sector of each and every targeted area. Of the few local people who survived the first drone onslaught, then the ground assault, they stagger from the remnants of the decimated buildings, bloodied and beaten, and either waving improvised white flags or raising their hands in surrender. As the medical teams rush over to assist them, one word in Spanish resonates above all others: gracias. As much as the troops are moved by this simple gesture, as much as they realize that they've contributed to removing these people from out under the tyranny of the drug cartels, it's a bittersweet victory. So many victims, many of them children, are testament to the true cost of the operation. Hour 24. Biden calls a press conference at the White House. In the James S. Brady press briefing room, the president informs an unexpected world of the news that the US, in cooperation with the Mexican government, launched a bold and decisive attack at the very heart of the Mexican drug cartels. Ladies and gentlemen, we got him. We finally got him. The press contingent looks on in confusion. None have been briefed regarding the true nature and scale of the operation. Shortly after I came into office, Biden continues, I read a report from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Do you know how many deaths were directly linked to the illegal opioids that have flooded into our country from Mexico? Well, let me tell you, 100,306. No more. We've just taken a huge step in finally winning the war on drugs. Biden is seen as a hero and his actions lauded across the globe. Of course, this scenario is just one of many ways the US military could potentially wreck the Mexican drug cartels. In reality, however, the American government would face many legal problems in launching any such attack, not to mention fierce opposition in Congress. Firstly, they would have to redefine the status of the drug cartels through the US courts, but this could conceivably be overcome in quite a straightforward manner. By designating the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs, Biden would be legally entitled to deploy military force to overcome the drug problems posed by Mexico. This may not be the most popular or welcome of moves, though. If the drug cartels were designated as FTOs, it would have a potentially crippling effect on the Mexican economy. Some experts estimate that it could hit the tourist sector to the tune of $20 billion, or 8.5% of its GDP. Why? Quite simply, people would be scared of traveling to a country riddled with terroristic elements. Other economic arguments are just as compelling. Trade between the US and Mexico alone is worth $72.1 billion. Eye-watering figures that illustrate exactly how much is at stake here. But at what point does the social cost of the opioid crisis in the US outweigh the economic ramifications of war on the Mexican drug cartels? We've already provided some chilling statistics at the top of the video, but perhaps it pays to dig deeper to paint an even starker picture of the crisis. As mentioned earlier in the video, both countries are well aware of the scale of the issue and the human cost involved in the opioid crisis, even if, historically, the US has been reluctant to intervene militarily to not worsen its already shaky relationship with Mexico. Inherent issues which can be traced back to the Mexican-American War of 1846–48. With the other conflicts that are raging around the world at present, most notably Russia's brutal attempts to annex Ukraine, López Obrador may fear a similar fate. But any notion of the US carving up the country and taking over is, of course, mere conjecture. What can't be denied are the many legal rumblings that have taken place in recent years. Following the death of US nationals in Mexico, Senator Lindsey Graham, co-sponsored by Senators John Kennedy, Marsha Blackburn, Josh Hawley, Steve Daines, Mike Lee, and Mike Brown, introduced the Ending the Narcos Act of 2023 to the United States Senate, or to give it its full name, Ending the Notorious, Aggressive, and Remorseless Criminal Organizations and Syndicates Act. Following on from a previous point, the purpose of this act was to designate Mexican cartels and other transnational criminal organizations as FTOs. The The reasoning behind this is that these organizations pose significant threats to US citizens due to their involvement in acts of terrorism, including the production and importation of illicit substances such as fentanyl. Again, the ultimate aim was to enable the US to tackle this threat with the kind of extreme military force described earlier in the video. And it would be remiss not to mention the migrant crisis. Everyone remembers Donald Trump's infamous Build a Wall speech from his successful presidential campaign back in 2016. In a BBC report from 2022, there were a record 239,416 encounters between illegal migrants and US law enforcement at the Mexico border. And while Biden has attempted to address the issue by offering legal status to an estimated 11 million undocumented people in the US, his proposal failed to gain enough bipartisan support to pass into law. Conservative critics have been outraged by what they see as being soft on the border. And the figures back this up, with a significant spike in number during Biden's term in office, something which could prove critical if, as expected, he faces off against Trump again in the upcoming election. And if all that wasn't bad enough, there's an even more sinister geopolitical subplot to our story: China. As highlighted earlier, Beijing is known to be supplying the ingredients that make up fentanyl to the Mexican drug cartels. The natural question is why? What does China get out of aiding and abetting criminal organizations? Instability, thousands of deaths each year, a general weakening of the social structure across vast swathes of America. The list could go on. But there is historical precedence, if not a justification, for China's stance here. The country sees fentanyl as revenge for what it calls the century of humiliation and the opium wars of the 1830s and 40s. These kinds of tactics, therefore, can be seen as a historically based foreign policy to ensure that China remains strong and its enemies weak. Case in point, China had suspended cooperation with the United States on drug policies in 2023, but agreed to resume bilateral cooperation in January 2024. Undoubtedly, there's a much bigger picture here to consider, one that would take up one, if not several more videos to cover in its entirety. But if there is one underlying factor that's stopping the US from deploying military force against the Mexican drug cartels, it's the dreaded possibility of mission creep. In so many conflicts of recent years, and we can go back to Vietnam and beyond, the US has deployed forces in a region for what it initially saw as a short-term basis to achieve its military aims, be that to stabilize a country or gain a geopolitical foothold in a region crucial to US interests abroad. All too often, this has led to years of attritional fighting, and in the case of Vietnam and Afghanistan, embarrassing and costly withdrawals, with the country in question being in a much worse situation than it was before. The last thing Biden or whoever happens to occupy the White House in the future wants is a long, drawn-out, painful, bloody war in Mexico. For that reason alone, any military action against the drug cartels is highly unlikely now or in the short to medium term. Just quite how the US solves the opioid crisis and gains an upper hand in the war on drugs remains to be seen. But perhaps the words of former Guatemalan leader Otto Pérez Molina, a paraphrase from a famous Albert Einstein quote, sums up the situation most succinctly. We cannot continue doing the same thing and expect different results. Now we're coming to the end of the video, and it's time to ask you what you think about the opioid crisis in America and how the government should respond. Do you think the problem is so serious that some kind of military intervention is inevitable? Or do you think the economic factors highlighted in this video make military action all but impossible? And what of the bigger geopolitical picture? Can the US sit back as China floods its towns and cities with highly addictive substances like fentanyl? It's certainly a tough call for whoever will be sitting in the White House come November, but sadly, it's not a problem that's going to go away on its own. If America doesn't act now, it may well be counting the cost for generations to come. Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out what's stopping the US Army from attacking Mexican cartels, or click this other video instead. The current era of global politics has often been described as a return to the days of great power competition. But while this is usually taken to mean competition between the United States and other rising powers, it's worth remembering that a major war could just as easily break out between two countries much closer together, China and Russia. While leaders of the two countries have stressed their close friendship for years, the truth is a bit more complicated. While they both have autocratic governments opposed to the Western-led international order, in reality, there are many points of contention in the China-Russia relationship, any number of which could potentially lead to a conflict. But what would a war between these two vast countries actually look like? Who would have the upper hand? And what would it mean for the rest of the world? To answer these questions, we first need to take a look back at the way Chinese-Russian relations developed. Their shared modern history began in the earliest days of the Cold War, with the 1949 victory of the Chinese Communist Party in the Chinese Civil War. The Soviet Union quickly moved to become a patron of the new country, seeing it as a critical junior partner in the broader Cold War. This was formalized in 1950, as Mao and Stalin signed the so-called Treaty of Friendship, Alliance and Mutual Assistance. This treaty strengthened the two countries' geopolitical relationship on political, military and economic levels, including a loan from the USSR of over $300 million. However, the two countries' relationship began to deteriorate soon afterwards, leading to the Sino-Soviet split in the late 1950s. This followed several years where China worked with a large number of Soviet advisors who encouraged the Chinese leaders to follow the Russian model of development with an emphasis on heavy industry funded by taxes and levies from the peasantry, whilst making consumer goods a low priority. When Stalin died in 1953, Mao felt he was now the senior leader and was resentful when the new Soviet leaders Malenkov and Khrushchev did not recognize him as such. Mao had ignored many of Stalin's requests, but he had respected him as a world leader and symbol of communism. But in 1956, Khrushchev denounced Stalin during his secret speech, and although Mao didn't react publicly to the news, he was privately infuriated. Tensions continued to build through 1959, when Khrushchev held a summit meeting with US President Dwight Eisenhower. The Soviets were alarmed by developments within China and sought to appease the West. They also refused to honor their earlier commitment to help China develop nuclear weapons and support Mao in his border dispute with China. Mao was offended by these actions. He felt Khrushchev was being far too accommodating to Western demands. However, the Soviet leadership were well aware that the Americans could match or exceed their nuclear capabilities, and they sought to engage the US in strategic dialogue and negotiations aimed at avoiding the outbreak of war. For much the same reason, the Soviet leadership became determined not to give Mao nuclear weapons. By June 1960, the split between Russia and China became public when Khrushchev and Peng Zhen openly clashed. During 1962, international events caused the final split between the Soviet Union and China. Mao criticized Khrushchev for backing down in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Khrushchev responded by declaring that Mao's policies would lead to nuclear war. By 1965, the Sino-Soviet split was an established fact, and the start of Mao's Cultural Revolution severed all contact between not only the two countries, but between China and most of the rest of the world. As late as 1970, Mao realized that he could not simultaneously confront the Soviet Union, United States, and suppress internal disorder. Mao decided that because of their geographical proximity, the Soviets were a greater threat, and so he decided to open a dialogue with America and so confront the USSR. In July 1971, Henry Kissinger made a secret visit to Beijing to make the arrangements for a visit by President Nixon in the following year. The Soviets retaliated by organizing their own summit with Nixon. This paved the way to creating a triangular relationship between Washington, Beijing, and Moscow, ending the worst period of confrontation between the USSR and China. Today, more than 30 years after the end of the Cold War, Russia and China maintain a complex relationship with a different set of tensions. But despite the declarations of friendship from both sides, the outbreak of war between them is always a possibility. And unlike the days of the Sino-Soviet split, Moscow wouldn't have the upper hand. China's enormous economic and military growth in the past 3 decades, and Russia's loss of most of its Soviet territory and human capital has drastically shifted the balance of power between the two. Today, China's economy is more than 3.5 times the size of Russia's, while its military is both more modern and better funded. Another major point of contention is far east of Russia, which many of the country's politicians believe has become part of China's sphere of influence. Declining Russian population and a failure to build infrastructure in the region since the end of the USSR has increased this trend further, especially as they have been replaced with Chinese immigrants and foreign investment. Similarly, Chinese interest in the region's extensive energy resources has dramatically increased in recent years, as the superpower's economic growth has begun to slow. A final point of contention between China and Russia has to do with the sale and manufacture of weapons. For decades, China was among the most reliable buyers of Soviet weaponry, but today, the country has developed its own extensive defense industry, in no small part due to espionage by Chinese agents, who have stolen plans for classified Russian technology for years. In some instances being caught red-handed. China has also violated many of its licensing agreements with Russia around fighter aircraft and other technology, building its own without continuing to buy engines and electronic systems from Russia. Given these trends, there are several major flashpoints between the two nations which could theoretically turn very ugly very fast. When it comes to a military showdown between the two powers, the scales have also tilted more and more firmly in favor of China. While Russian nuclear weapons and overall equipment stockpiles have long kept it as one of the foremost military powers, in recent years, estimates of the country's basic competency, availability of equipment, tactical effectiveness, and leadership have all come under serious question. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has shown that its armed forces are barely capable, and that they are far more suited for conflicts against weak forces like Syrian rebel groups. Up against even a small amount of NATO weaponry and support, Russian forces have fared disastrously. And while China's hardware is still nowhere near as advanced as that of NATO, there is good reason to believe that it would now outstrip Russia in any sort of direct military engagement. But Russia's recent failures have also cast doubt on the effectiveness of Chinese forces, especially since they have not fought an active war this century. And even back in 1979, China was militarily defeated by Vietnam, a far smaller country already exhausted from decades of war. While China claimed victory in the conflict, it failed to achieve its primary objective of preventing Vietnam from overthrowing the genocidal Chinese-backed Khmer Rouge government in neighboring Cambodia. While China's capabilities have grown enormously since then, and its military doctrine has been updated and modeled off of that of the US, the current forces are largely untested in battle. In one major way, this gives China a different problem from Russia, which has a military with substantial combat experience, but hopelessly outdated doctrine and equipment. And in a head-to-head contest between the two countries, China seems to have a definite advantage. But some experts have speculated that below the surface, its defense sector may have just as many issues. For instance, corruption in China may run just as deeply as in Russia, a problem which only came to light during President Xi Jinping's corruption purges in the late 2010s. Yet such purges were also more of a political tool than anything else, and likely did little to fix the root of the problem. So in a theoretical Chinese-Russian war, both sides would likely suffer from corruption and poor resource management. Similarly, the defenses on both sides, particularly Russia, would quickly become an issue. Russian air defenses have long been vaunted as among the most advanced in the world, but the war in Ukraine again cast doubt on this claim. Using drones, Ukraine has been able to penetrate Russian air defenses on numerous occasions, striking deep inside the country at military bases, command and control centers, and even cities. China has far, far more drones than Ukraine, suggesting that it could overwhelm Russian air defenses with relative ease. However, the reverse is also possible, as Russia still maintains a large stockpile of missiles capable of reaching Chinese cities, as well as numerous Iranian-manufactured drones. However, missiles and drones aside, it's clear that in a conflict, China would have a definite advantage in terms of funding, personnel, and overall capability. So how might such a war actually play out? On the ground, there would likely be skirmishes along most of the Russian-Chinese border, while sparsely populated Mongolia, which sits sandwiched between the two powers, would likely become a major avenue of attack. In the event of a Chinese invasion, Mongolia would provide a perfect staging ground to attack and seize land in the vulnerable Russian east. While Russia has historically kept substantial forces in the area to deter such an attack, the war in Ukraine has forced Putin to pull nearly all his available troops to the European border, leaving the south and east quite exposed to any attacks. China, on the other hand, has been able to maintain its forces along the Russian and Mongolian borders, giving it a distinct advantage on the ground. That's not to mention that the Chinese armed forces are far more numerous than Russia's, with almost double the active duty forces. And while numbers aren't everything, it seems likely that a Chinese ground attack on the south and east of Russia would be able to capture and hold large swathes of territory. However, one area where Russia would still have something of an advantage is in the air. The Russian Air Force, or VKS, has long been viewed as one of the world's most formidable, with a large fleet of reliable planes and even a number of next-gen fighter jets such as the Sukhoi Su-57. which utilizes stealth technology and advanced avionics. While China's fleet of fighter jets is more numerous, with over 1,200 aircraft to Russia's 750, there is little doubt that Russia would have a qualitative edge in the skies. Even so, the war in Ukraine has once again cast doubt on supposedly superior Russian capabilities, as the country has failed to establish air superiority at any stage of its invasion. As the UK Ministry of Defence recently noted, this reality has made it extremely difficult for Russian forces to take any new territory, as the lack of air support has led to repeated failures to break a Ukrainian bridgehead across the Dnipro River. In a conflict with a country as large and powerful as China, Russia would almost certainly be even more hard-pressed to field effective air support. This is especially true today, as Western sanctions from the invasion of Ukraine have made it impossible for Russia to obtain the components needed to produce more advanced fighters. China, while not on the best terms with Western states, does not suffer from the same level of crippling sanctions on its aerospace or broader defense industries. On the Chinese side, one major challenge in an offensive against Russia would be its comparative lack of tanker aircraft, limiting the ability of its air force to refuel near the front lines. Another area where Russia would historically have had a major advantage is in ground-based air defenses. Under Vladimir Putin's decades-long rule, Russia has continually upgraded its air defense systems, many of which are designed to fight off the far more powerful US Air Force. Until 2022, it was widely presumed that Russian air defenses, especially newer systems like the S-400 and S-500, could handle almost anything thrown at them. But on numerous occasions, they failed miserably against Ukrainian drone and missile attacks, in what the US-based Institute for the Study of War has called a systematic tactical failure, which suggests that Russian forces were unprepared to intercept missiles with the system or were unable to do so. Similarly, scholars from US Air University recently wrote that Russia continued to suffer from a strategic priority on defensive over offensive operations, failure to develop sufficient capacity and capability for operations at this scale, and comparatively immature operational concepts. As a result, Russian air defenses have failed to stop numerous Ukrainian strikes deep inside the country. In a potential conflict with China, this failure would likely be compounded, and there is good reason to believe that China could overwhelm Russian air defenses in most parts of the country. On the other hand, China's air defense systems are largely untested, so there is significant debate about their capabilities. However, as the RAND Corporation pointed out several years ago, Chinese systems are now advanced enough that they would pose a serious challenge even to the US. As they note, in 1996, the vast majority of China's 500-plus long-range surface-to-air missile systems were Chinese duplicates of the obsolete Russian SA-2 missile. By 2010, China had deployed roughly 200 launchers for double-digit SAMs. The newer missiles have more sophisticated seekers and ranges of up to 200 kilometers. Combined with more capable fighter aircraft and the addition of a new airborne warning and control system, the Chinese Integrated Air Defense System (IADS) has become a formidable obstacle. Given assessments like this, it's very possible that Chinese air defense systems now outstrip those of Russia. And in any military contest between the two powers, victory would likely come down to both control of the skies and resources to maintain that control. On a broader level, the development and maintenance of military technology would also be a major factor in a war between China and Russia. While both countries are at a general level of technological parity, they do differ significantly in their industrial bases and ability to produce more. China's economy is far larger, at $26.8 trillion to Russia's $4 trillion, a factor that would give it a substantial advantage in any drawn-out military engagement. Due to many of these factors, Russia's main chance of victory in such a war would be to utilize the element of surprise, as well as its asymmetric capabilities, such as the Wagner Group and other PMC groups with combat experience. But if Russia failed to secure large early gains, it's very likely that the balance of power would shift towards China, given its superior resources, manpower, and global connections. But in the end, the reality is that a fight between China and Russia would have no real winner. It would almost certainly be dragged down into a brutal and widespread war of attrition, with enormous destruction and potentially millions of civilian casualties. While China would certainly have the upper hand, we should always remember that any such contest would undoubtedly be a disaster for much of our modern world. But what do you think? Would Russia be able to hold off a Chinese attack? Or would China's military and economic might overwhelm a sanctioned and faltering Russian military? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis. Will Putin launch an attack on the USA? The possibility of a Russian attack on the US has been a top national security concern for decades. Since the earliest days of the Cold War, US policymakers have run war games and maintained preparations for a range of possible attacks. Now, with the war in Ukraine raging and US-Russia relations at their worst point in decades, it is a question which has returned to the minds of many. While such an event is still extremely unlikely to occur, it raises several hypothetical questions. What could a limited or not so limited Russian attack on US assets look like? What's our best guess at how things might play out? And what chance, if any, would Russia stand in a real war against the American military and NATO? One thing's for sure, Putin is not happy about the West repeatedly coming to Ukraine's aid in the Russo-Ukrainian war, and with Russia's army failing miserably on the battlefield, it may only be a matter of time before Putin's threats to either back off and stop helping Ukraine or face a showdown start coming in. Here's how it could go down. It's late 2023. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has been raging for over a year and a half, with both sides taking enormous amounts of casualties. But armed with more and more Western firepower and training, the Ukrainian military has pushed Russian troops out of most of eastern Ukraine. Russia's mass conscription and brutal human wave tactics have not been enough, and it has lost nearly all of its conquered territory outside of Crimea. Increasingly desperate and fearing that oligarchs or commanders will soon topple him from power, Vladimir Putin decides to pull out all the stops. He threatens to do anything necessary to stop the West from further arming Ukraine and to regain Russia's historical sphere of influence. But most assume he is still bluffing. However, indications from US intelligence hint that this time it might be something more serious. Putin puts out a televised statement claiming that the US and NATO have 72 hours to begin removing their on-the-ground trainers and Patriot missile systems to halt the flow of Western weapons into the country, and if they do not, Russia reserves the right to defend itself. President Joe Biden responds, saying that the West will not back down or be intimidated by Putin. For a brief moment, everyone falls silent, but the peace doesn't last long before the storm hits. Several days pass, with continued heavy fighting in Ukraine, but no more threats. Then, suddenly, an innocent software update from the week before crashes internal servers from the White House, Department of Defense, NATO High Command, and Ukrainian armed forces, as well as more than a dozen defense-associated companies using advanced malware. At the same time, a mass-distributed denial of service or DDoS attack overwhelms secondary computer systems, flooding them with traffic and crashing them. On the malware-infected computers, a message appears demanding that the US halt its support of Ukraine or face further consequences. What now? According to experts like retired General Herbert "Hawk" Carlyle, former head of the Air Combat Command, such escalation in cyberspace would likely follow a period of heightened tensions and warnings, and in an all-out conflict, the US and NATO would have to initially counter Russian cyber capabilities. Because of advance warning from intelligence agencies, the US would most likely have the time to prepare for a physical Russian attack by increasing its combat capacity in both Europe and Alaska. But it could get darker. A conflict opening with a hostile cyber attack could come with much less warning, and provide Russia with a small early advantage against vastly superior US and NATO capabilities. Alright, so Putin is officially gearing up for a fight. What comes next? As US, NATO, and Ukrainian authorities scramble to bring their essential computer systems back online, intelligence agencies begin to pick up increased activity at Russian missile launch sites on both Ukrainian and Polish borders, as well as at major military installations around Vladivostok and Kaliningrad, at two ends of the country. In response to the cyber attack and troop movement, the Department of Defense moves the US to DEFCON 2. In this posture, only ever used during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, the US would have the Army, Navy, and Air Force poised for combat and ready to deploy in hours. US and NATO Cyber Command then quickly mount a retaliatory cyber operation, which could involve substantial disruption of Russian communications and activation of malware attacks on critical computer systems, power grids, and military bases. But let's say Putin takes it a step further. As both Western and Russian computer systems are still recovering that same day, the Russian Air Force begins flying sorties into NATO airspace over Poland. Then, suddenly, Russian missiles fired from the border of Ukraine strike 3 air bases in Poland and Romania involved in supplying military assistance to Ukraine. Despite air defenses, there are roughly a dozen US and NATO casualties and significant damage to the base's infrastructure. Some of the missiles miss their target and hit nearby areas, killing another dozen civilians. Putin releases a statement promising further such attacks on other targets if NATO and US assistance to Ukraine does not end. Within minutes, news of the attack reaches the US president, transmitted via a network of 6 jamming-resistant satellites which provide real-time communications to the US, Canadian, Dutch, Australian, and British militaries. Let's pause for a moment to hear what military experts have to say about the likelihood of this type of event sequence. In a December 2022 paper, the RAND Corporation, the DoD's think tank, outlines 3 possible scenarios for a Russian first strike on a US or NATO target: demonstrative, focused, or less restrained. This hypothetical is their Scenario C, a focused attack, the third most severe of their 4 Russian strike possibilities. At this point, DoD and NATO leadership would have to decide whether to continue escalation and retaliate with kinetic strikes of their own, or to back down and try to defuse the situation. Because of the severity of such an attack with casualties from multiple NATO members, US and NATO leaders would almost certainly decide the attack requires retaliation in kind to satisfy NATO members' concerns about the credibility of Article 5. In short, it's time to fight back. Advised to take early action, the president calls an emergency session of Congress, which within hours passes a joint resolution authorizing the limited use of military force against Russia and its allies. The president gives a televised speech stating that the US has taken its own retaliatory actions for the unprovoked attack, but that the US response is purely defensive. US ground forces will not enter Russia, he declares, in hopes of stopping escalation to the level of full war. The US therefore decides to launch a proportional response on Russian targets in Ukraine. Even before the speech is finished, 2 US-controlled Reaper drones take off from air bases in Poland. Once over Ukrainian airspace, they strike Russian air bases and missile defenses in Crimea, killing several dozen soldiers and destroying a number of planes. At the same time, the US launches a number of modified SM-3 missiles from its ships around the world, knocking out a handful of Russian communication satellites. This strike leaves Russia with limited GPS targeting and communications capabilities. So far, so good. But while Biden and other Western leaders urge Putin to back down and not escalate things anymore, they receive no answer. Putin decides he cannot back down now. The next day, 2 MiG-31 fighter jets enter Polish airspace. Before they can be destroyed, they fire Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, managing to hit 2 NATO missile batteries and killing another half-dozen soldiers. At the same time, all gas from the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is shut off, leaving millions of homes in Europe with no gas supply. By this point, escalation in Europe is nearly inevitable. NATO calls an emergency summit, and after 2 days of initial resistance from Turkey and several other states, Article 5 is officially invoked. But top NATO officials stress that their operations against Russia will be limited and purely defensive. Defensive, but powerful. With Article 5 invoked, the first priority of NATO troops is to take out Russian air defenses near Europe, before striking air bases and missile launch sites to try and stop shelling of NATO assets. So after multiple missile salvos from US submarines and aircraft carriers in the Black Sea and Mediterranean wipe out most of Russia's western surface-to-air defenses, fighter jets and long-range bombers from NATO countries begin to engage in aerial dogfights with Russian planes across Eastern Europe. The older Russian jets are quickly outmatched and outnumbered, but combined with the remaining air defenses, they are still able to take out a handful of F-15s and other NATO assets. Fighting is especially concentrated around western Poland and Kaliningrad, which NATO strikes repeatedly and declares a no-fly zone over. The massive US fleet of 650 tanker jets also takes off from North America and begins to circle the Atlantic, providing in-air refueling for more F-15s and F-16s called in from air bases in the US. American cargo planes also embark across the ocean, carrying troops, heavy vehicles, and supplies, which will be used to resupply the growing front in Eastern Europe. And this is just the beginning. At the same time, all US troops in Europe are recalled from leave to be mobilized. The US Army's 173rd Airborne Brigade Combat Team in Italy and its 2nd Cavalry Regiment in Germany join NATO forces from across Europe and engage Russian troops on the borders of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Poland. While Russia's failures in Ukraine make the prospect of them taking another national capital doubtful at best, Russian missiles and artillery begin striking towns near the border, causing immense damage to the area's infrastructure and killing dozens more civilians. More cyber attacks are also unleashed against the power grids in Estonia, Poland, and Lithuania, causing rolling blackouts. US air defenses in Poland are able to down some of the incoming missiles, but many which were fired indiscriminately still get through. Putin also orders a full-scale draft and mobilization of all young men in Russia, seeking to get cannon fodder to the front as quickly as possible. Great! More fresh-faced Russian conscripts heading to the front lines. Has Putin learned nothing from his past mistakes? Regardless, let's take a look at what's happening in Europe while all this is going on. As you can imagine, things get pretty bad. While many national leaders urge people to remain calm, commercial air and rail traffic in Eastern Europe grinds to a halt, and the stock market begins to crash, creating panic. Nord Stream gas remains cut off, and refugees fleeing the crisis also continue to move west, stoking fears of a mass humanitarian crisis across Europe. The UN continues to press for a ceasefire, but Putin says he will not back down until his demands are met, though he stops short of explicitly threatening nuclear action. Western leaders respond that he must immediately cease all military activity, withdraw, and stand down all Russian troops. They announce a range of crippling new sanctions against Russian businesses, individuals, and weapon suppliers. This alone may not stop Putin's aggression. Every bit of pressure that can be added to weaken Russia's strength and security could contribute to its eventual defeat. The following day, combined NATO and US forces, including armored brigades from Poland, head north to fully cut off Russia from Kaliningrad and encircle the exclave, with the US 6th and 7th fleets moving into striking positions in the Black Sea and Pacific. While Russia could likely muster some ground troops outside of Ukraine, they would be unlikely to launch a full invasion of any Baltic country in a conflict with the US or NATO, especially since the Baltic troops are far from Russia's best. As noted by Mike Kaufman, Russia analyst at the Center for Naval Analysis, Russia's military modernization and force structure expansion had been ignoring the Baltic region until only recently. Despite provocative air and naval activity concentrated in the area, Russian forces based there are principally defensive and aging to boot. While many analysts still argued prior to the invasion of Ukraine that Russia could surround Baltic capitals in as little as 36 hours, those estimates have since come under serious doubt. In a serious confrontation with multiple NATO member states, Russia would likely take significant early losses and be forced to rely mostly on irregular warfare, missile strikes, and artillery. So back and forth missile strikes and aerial dogfights rage, along with artillery barrages and ground combat on Russia's borders with the Baltic states, while the United Nations continues to call for a ceasefire. Things are about to escalate. At this point, nearly a week into the growing conflict, Russia's resources are already strained to the point of total depletion. But Putin desperately needs something to make a statement and try to force the West to give him concessions. What will he do? Assuming that he does not opt for the nuclear option, fingers crossed, right? One possibility is to use Russia's vast geography to its advantage. So in an attempt to stretch out US resources, Russian fighter jets attempt to launch preemptive strikes against several US military installations in Alaska. These attacks are primarily aimed at disrupting communications and destroying military assets before they can be mobilized to attack Russia from the Pacific. While US missile defenses stop nearly all the strikes, several damage US communications arrays. Russia also launches another round of DDoS cyber attacks against US computer networks in order to further disrupt communications and try to sow confusion among American forces. In addition to this, submarines from Russia's Pacific Fleet begin to move, putting more of their long-range missiles within striking range of US bases in the Pacific. The US Navy responds by moving the 3rd Fleet to strategic locations up and down the west coast, and the 7th Fleet into a blockade off Russia's eastern coast, as part of an effort to counter Russia's naval presence in the Pacific. The US Air Force launches bombers from bases in Japan, Guam, Hawaii, and Alaska towards key targets across eastern Russia, striking military facilities at Vladivostok, Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, Kamchatsky, Magadan, and elsewhere, while engaging enemy fighters over Alaska and northern Russia as part of a defensive operation against further strikes into American airspace. Because Russia has diverted many of its Pacific air defenses to the border with Ukraine, many US missiles find their targets, destroying numerous Russian air bases and communication centers. US Cyber Command also launches another round of cyber attacks against both Russian computer systems and missile silos, disabling more of them before they can be launched. Meanwhile, allied US and NATO ground troops dig into defensive positions on their respective borders with Ukraine and Belarus, as tensions over nuclear weapons continues to mount. In response, Russian troops and allied militias gather in Belarus, preparing to try and retake the Kaliningrad corridor, but by this point, much of Russia's communication infrastructure and military hardware is damaged or gone, and its forces stretched thin, forcing Putin to rely more heavily on asymmetric warfare or shock value. Desperate times call for desperate measures, sure, but do they work? The following day, Russian allied militia groups begin to launch guerrilla-style raids across the borders from Belarus, Kaliningrad, and Transnistria, attacking both civilian and military targets. Running out of both ammunition and artillery, they use improvised explosive devices or IEDs and other makeshift weapons to terrorize villages and towns. NATO forces respond with more heavy artillery and shelling and precision missile strikes for the next 2 days, aiming to cut off the flow of insurgents across the borders. Since Russia's military assets are now significantly depleted, its proxy forces fail to retake either the Kaliningrad corridor or more territory in Ukraine. Despite the growing NATO casualties due to IEDs and other attacks, the insurgents are decimated by the relentless artillery strikes. In Ukraine, troops take advantage of Russia's depleted resources to launch a lightning offensive into Crimea, shelling Sevastopol and moving to cut off the peninsula from Russia. Meanwhile, in the east, Russia's Air Force and Pacific Fleet, as well as most of its communications arrays, have been crippled by the US, putting substantial pressure on Putin. In a last-ditch effort to overwhelm NATO and US resolve, Putin orders a third, massive barrage of cyber attacks. The attacks target the wider power grid and are able to cause mass blackouts in cities across Europe and America, leaving millions without power, even as refugees continue to flood into Western Europe. EU and US officials declare a state of emergency and ask for humanitarian assistance from the other UN member states. Rolling blackouts last 2 days, during which time heavy fighting continues near Russia and Belarus's borders, both against regular troops and militia groups targeting civilians. Despite the cyber attacks, Russian allied troops continue to take far heavier losses than those of NATO and the US, and are pushed back from the edge of the Baltic states deeper into Russian territory. Holding to their word, NATO troops do not pursue them, but set up a heavily fortified buffer zone on the border. Then, after weeks of heavy shelling and being blockaded from air, land, and sea, the remaining Russian troops at Kaliningrad surrender, and the exclave is taken by NATO ground troops. In the east, the US blockade continues, as do retaliatory strikes on Russian communications and missile areas. But the surrender at Kaliningrad and mass attack on the European power grid continue to spread fears that the war will become a nuclear conflict between NATO allies and Russia. National leaders from around the world urge an end to the fighting. Despite this, Putin gives a speech raging against NATO's imperialism and says Russia will not back down if Kaliningrad is not returned to Russian control and Western support for Ukraine does not cease. With a global recession and refugee crisis deepening, the situation looks grim. Are all roads leading towards a full-blown nuclear war? After nearly 2 weeks of intense fighting between NATO allies and Russian allied forces, NATO leaders announce plans for a full-scale invasion into Belarus if Moscow does not withdraw its support for separatists operating within Ukraine and NATO territory immediately. This announcement comes on top of growing speculation about whether or not nuclear war might erupt between Moscow and Washington after days of escalating combat between both sides, and the mass Russian disruption to European power grids. But despite his cyber attack, at this point Putin is out of options. Most of Russia's military capabilities have been destroyed, and there are critical shortages of ammunition, equipment, food, medicine, and other essentials. In under 2 weeks, Russia has lost tens of thousands more troops compared to the relatively light losses by NATO and the US. Its Pacific Fleet and Eastern military installations have been wiped out by the US, and in the West, it has lost control of both Kaliningrad and much of Crimea, putting the critical naval base of Sevastopol under Ukrainian control. The only major city in Ukraine still held by Russia is Mariupol, where its remaining occupation troops are dug in trying to avoid artillery and drone strikes. Most Russian forces have been forced to pull back miles from the border, where they continue to face shelling, and hospitals are completely overwhelmed. Supply lines are so destroyed that many unlucky soldiers have even begun to starve. As conditions worsen in the next few days, Putin's war effort begins its inevitable collapse. Substantial numbers of Russian troops begin to surrender or mutiny, refusing to follow orders and turning themselves over as prisoners. Finally, buckling under pressure and trying to save face, Putin announces that Russia has taught the West a lesson and is open to negotiations. An emergency session of the UN Security Council is convened several days later, where plans begin to be drawn up for a ceasefire, the return of Kaliningrad to Russian control, autonomy for areas of eastern Ukraine, and the creation of a demilitarized zone along the Russian border. Although this is just one hypothetical scenario for a US-NATO-Russia conflict, which is still very unlikely, it demonstrates some of the options available to both sides in open conventional warfare. An extremely outmatched Russia would likely have to rely on asymmetric strategies, but even that would likely do little to halt the combined efforts of the US military and NATO. With their combined firepower, logistical strength, and technology, there is almost no non-nuclear scenario where Russia could hold its own militarily. Even so, this example illustrates the devastating toll on human life that could result from even a short conventional war. But what do you think? What would happen if Russia attacked the US? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content.
On April 1st, Israel is believed to have launched an attack on the Iranian consulate in Syria, an event that marked a massive escalation of tensions between the two countries. Iran lost one of its leading soldiers, Brigadier General Mohammad Reza Zahedi, in the attack, along with several commanders from its Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Iran didn't take the attack lying down. Approximately 2 weeks later, Iran launched a terrifying combined missile and drone strike against Israel. Around 300 aerial threats were sent into the skies, targeting several Israeli locations, but most were shot down before they could do any real damage. But Israel wasn't alone in defending itself against the Iranian threat. As the US Department of Defense highlighted in an April 16 press release, it also took part in the defensive operation. Its Central Command forces, supported by destroyers the USS Karni and USS Ali, destroyed over 80 of the drones Iran launched, along with around 6 ballistic missiles. In doing so, the US may have played into Iran's hands. Following the attack, the prospect of war between Iran and the United States is higher than it's been in years. And in this video, we're going to theorize one way the war might happen, hour by hour and month by month. Hour 1. Deeper within the Sadabad complex, Iran's president, Ibrahim Raisi, feels as if he's starting to see his plans come to fruition. Mere days ago, he baited the United States into destroying some of its missiles and drones. Yes, that aerial assault targeted Israel, and he'd hoped to cause some damage against one of his greatest enemies in the Middle East. But his real goal was to tempt the United States into responding to his strike. Now he has justification for what he's planned. Raisi has spent over a decade cultivating relationships with Islamic insurgent groups throughout Asia. Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, even Hezbollah in Lebanon. All are on his payroll, receiving funds and equipment to carry out their attacks, and what Raisi provides allows him to use these smaller groups as proxies for his geopolitical goals while keeping his own hands relatively clean. But more important to him are the resources his ties to those groups provide. Not only can Raisi attack his enemies with these proxies while maintaining some level of deniability, but he can rely on them to insert combatants into countries he'd otherwise be unable to reach. Countries like the United States. Over several years, Raisi and his proxies have been sending agents into the United States. Some have been caught, but far more have managed to establish themselves as citizens of the country. They've just been waiting for their call to attack. Raisi provides it, but the attack doesn't come in the traditional military sense. There will be no fighting between Raisi's insurgents and the United States military. Instead, each will become a martyr, targeting locations throughout the United States where large numbers of people gather to wreak havoc and sow the seeds of terror in the country. Concerts, sporting events, malls, they're all targeted with synchronized attacks that result in the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians, primarily the victims of suicide bombings or gunfire. At the same time, Iran attacks American interests closer to home. Missiles fly over the Strait of Hormuz, through which 33,000 ships, including American oil tankers, sail every year. The attack is devastating, destroying several oil tankers and cargo ships, though Raisi isn't able to take out the USS Bataan or the USS Carter Hall, both of which have been stationed in or near the strait since August 2023. That doesn't matter, he's happy to engage both in a naval battle after the fact. What mattered most was the statement. Ibrahim Raisi has just declared war on the United States. Hour 2. President Joe Biden and his most trusted advisors are scrambling. Over the last hour, they've received words of dozens of attacks on American soil, along with news of missiles targeting American commercial and oil vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. This is no coincidence. Intelligence briefings in the immediate aftermath of the attacks confirm what Biden already feared. All of the attacks can be linked to Iran. As data continues to flow in, the names of those who killed civilians on American soil and the nature of the missiles flying over the Strait of Hormuz, Biden comes to terms with the fact that the US is now at war. More is coming. Hour 3. Raisi doesn't take much time to relish in the success of his initial attacks. He needs to do all he can to prevent a hasty American response, which means turning his focus toward the country's regional allies, the United Arab Emirates, or UAE, and Saudi Arabia. Cyber warfare is the next step. According to America's own Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency's assessments, Iran represents a major cybersecurity threat to the rest of the world, primarily because of its willingness to conduct aggressive operations. State-sponsored malware and ransomware attacks are already common, but what Raisi has planned now will surpass anything Iran has done before. His crack team of computer experts has spent the last year infecting specific targets in Saudi Arabia and the UAE with a spin-off of the Menorah spying malware. Through that malware, Iran has established communication with several command and control servers on home soil, through which it compromises the infected systems to damage them at critical junctures. That malware's executables are running on overdrive today. Raisi's computer experts target the Al Dhafra Air Base, host to 5,000 American military personnel, just outside Abu Dhabi, shutting the base's communications and computer equipment down temporarily. The 10 bases the US has in Saudi Arabia are targeted with similar attacks, all designed to hamper communications and slow down the US response. However, Raisi doesn't send his troops into either country. To do so would be suicidal, as he doesn't have the resources to fight the Saudi and UAE militaries on top of fighting against the United States. He just wants to make his threat known. These attacks are his bargaining chip, one he's using to cow the United States into relinquishing the tightness of its grasp over Middle Eastern politics. Now all he has to do is sit back, bide his time, and wait for the American response. Hour 24. In the United States, President Biden has spent the last day working with his advisors to prepare America's counter to Iranian aggression. Normally, he'd rely on sanctions to force Iran to back down. It's a tactic that the US has used successfully in the past, and it has sanctions active now, but Biden knows that won't be enough this time. Nevertheless, his team has quickly drafted a new round of sanctions, primarily targeted at Iran's ability to export oil to other countries. If the US were able to put a dent in the 1.29 million barrels of oil Iran exports daily, it could hit Raisi in his pocket. That's unlikely to happen. Most of those barrels go to China, an Iranian ally, but even so, Biden implements the sanctions, and his partners in NATO follow suit. A little financial damage is better than none at all. More important will be his response to Iran's attacks in the Strait of Hormuz. After all, he knows that Raisi can't send his military onto American soil, so the US will have to engage him closer to home to show that it's simply not lying down and allowing the attacks to happen. Furthermore, he can't allow Iran to have control over that passage of water. Too much cargo and oil that's valuable to the United States passes through. He has to control it as quickly as possible, both to hurt Iran and protect America's interests. The USS Bataan and the USS Carter Hall are both on alert and have orders to attack any Iranian naval vessels they find. Biden also seeks help from the Combined Task Force, or CTF-150, a multinational force that includes ships from France, Germany, and the UK, to help him start the fighting early in the strait. That force contributes almost 15 ships, though Pakistan withdraws in an effort to stay neutral and will help Biden conduct a tit-for-tat naval battle in the strait and throughout the Persian Gulf until a stronger naval fleet arrives from the United States. With those early measures in place, Biden has to turn his focus to his own people. America was attacked on its own soil in multiple locations by terrorists who he now knows were funded and supported by Iran. Not only must he bring solace to a damaged nation, but he must prepare it for war. Week 1. As several American warships, in addition to 2 of its aircraft carriers, make the journey toward the Persian Gulf, Biden has been preparing for the next stage of his offensive. It'll take between 4 and 6 weeks for his ships to reach the Strait of Hormuz, which is why it's so crucial for CTF-150 to do its job now. Once they arrive, he'll institute a blockade, giving America control of the ships that sail through the strait, in addition to allowing him to position his aircraft carriers so that he can launch aerial assaults on Iran. America's navy will be key to its victory, with 472 ships compared to Iran's 101, including 11 aircraft carriers to 0 for Iran and 45 more submarines. America knows it can come out on top in the Persian Gulf. Besides a handful of corvettes and frigates to support its 19 submarines, Iran's navy is mostly made up of patrol vessels. That will play against Raisi in the long term, as Iran will be able to do little to prevent America from taking the Persian Gulf and setting up blockades, but that will come in time. For now, Biden has to rely on the smattering of bases the US has set up near Iran. The country's bases in the UAE and Saudi Arabia are back up and running, giving Biden thousands of troops he could send to storm Iran. But he doesn't send that order. Instead, those troops are prepared to move to the coast lining the Saudi and UAE sides of the Persian Gulf. Once the US controls that stretch of water, it'll establish a through line using Saudi Arabia, through which it will funnel troops to transports in the Persian Gulf to ship them into Iran. America's alliance with Israel will also pay dividends. Iran's war with the US was triggered because of an attack on Israel. Now that America has officially entered the fray, Israel is more confident in its ability to directly declare war against Iran. It has backup. It's not going to fight alone. And now that Iran has launched such devastating and public attacks on the United States, popular support has started to lean in Israel's favor. So, as the UAE and Saudi Arabia provide the US with inroads into Iran via the Persian Gulf, Biden also sends ships and troops sailing through the Mediterranean to reach Israel. From there, America can launch aerial attacks and perhaps even send ships via the Red Sea into the Arabian Sea to cut off any support others might send to Iran. All in good time. For now, Biden simply has to wait for his navy to arrive. Week 2. The tit-for-tat fighting in the Persian Gulf, and particularly the Strait of Hormuz, hasn't been going in Iran's favor. But it's not all bad news for Raisi. One of his submarines managed to sink the USS Carter Hall, taking out the small ferry-class dockship. But Raisi knows America's navy is coming, and he needs to do as much damage as he can, as fast as he can. That means turning to Iran's huge stockpile of missiles. According to Iran Watch, the country has around 3,000 ballistic missiles stockpiled, notwithstanding a growing collection of land attack cruise missiles. The country has also developed solid propellant missiles, allowing for faster firing and acceleration, and it's those missiles that'll be turned against the few American ships in the Persian Gulf right now. Khyber Shakhan and Emad missiles are fired from silos on the Iranian mainland, capable of traveling 900 miles and 1,056 miles respectively. Those missiles can easily reach the American ships in the Gulf. They're backed by Shahab-3 missiles, which can travel 808 miles, as Iran launches a battery against the American ships. But Raisi doesn't stop there. Dozens of the Shahed-136 drones are sent over the Persian Gulf. These drones, which are the same as those Raisi used to attack Israel mere weeks ago, carry a small explosive payload that detonates upon impact with a target. They may not be strong enough alone to take out the USS Bataan, but when combined with the missile volley coming out of the country, that ship's anti-air defenses are soon overwhelmed. It sinks. And with further missile attacks coming, the dozen or so ships that are part of CTF-150 choose to withdraw to a safe distance. They've done their jobs, but now that Iran has shown a willingness to send missiles into what was previously a naval battle, they'll sit out until reinforcements arrive from the United States. Week 3. Raisi's plans have worked so far. He's retaken the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, even though he can only protect those waterways with patrol boats and a small fleet of submarines. That doesn't matter. He knows the US will take them both back when their full fleet arrives. What he's not so concerned about is whether the US will try a full land invasion once it secures the Persian Gulf. That would be unwise. Iran is the 18th largest country in the world in terms of pure land mass, and its geography makes trying to invade a treacherous prospect. The US can't enter from the east. That would mean going through Afghanistan, which the US recently exited, and essentially starting a second war. Add 2 deserts into the mix, and American troops will be ripe for the picking if they came from the east. A Western invasion is more possible thanks to America managing to convince Saudi Arabia and the UAE to allow it to use bases in those 2 countries to home in on the Persian Gulf. But the Zagros Mountains, which line much of Iran's western borders, means an incursion wouldn't be simple. If America wanted to land troops into the country, it would likely need to do so via the same water pass Saddam Hussein used when Iraq invaded Iran in the 1980s. But even that isn't a surefire thing. The invading forces would still run up against the Zagros Mountains, and that's after negotiating the swampy terrain in the southwest where the Tigris and Euphrates intertwine. Raisi believes his country is a fortress. With the Persian Gulf temporarily secured, he focuses on coordinating more terror attacks. Iran's proxies are being weeded out in the United States, but enough evade the authorities long enough to commit more bombings and shootings. Raisi knows those insurgents are a finite resource. With the US imposing strict restrictions on travel, it's unlikely that Iran will be able to sneak many more of its fighters into the country. But that's okay too. Those who are already there have done their jobs. The American people are panicking. They don't know where the next attack will come from. And Raisi feels that helping to build this panic could soon sap the country's appetite for war. Weeks 4 to 6. Biden has re-evaluated his plans slightly as his naval forces arrive to the Persian Gulf. Though he'll still send thousands of troops to supplement the military bases America has bordering the Gulf, those troops won't invade directly. That would just lead to more bloodshed than he believes is necessary, with thousands of Americans likely to be killed as they filter into Iran from the southwest. Instead, he'll send troops into Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, a constant presence to keep Iran on edge. The US chooses to respond to Iran's missile volleys in kind. As its ships arrive in the Persian Gulf, they set about the task of clearing the waterways of the patrol boats Iran has patrolling. The country's few corvettes and frigates are easy targets for America's destroyers, with the arrival of a small fleet of submarines proving more than a match for Iran's own fleet. Now in position, those ships prepare to fire missiles at select targets on the Iranian mainland. But they won't be the only form of attack the US leverages. Accompanying the fleet that takes the Persian Gulf are 2 aircraft carriers, the USS George H.W. Bush and the USS Gerald R. Ford. The latter carries over 75 aircraft, with the former carrying 60, and they'll be used to bring America's air superiority to bear. F-18 Super Hornets will make up the main attack force, backed up by Northrop Grumman E-2 Hawkeyes that will be responsible for conducting reconnaissance and helping the Super Hornets find targets on the Iranian mainland. When Iran inevitably sends its own jets into battle, Lockheed Martin F-35C Lightning fighter jets will engage Iran's fighters over the Persian Gulf. The goal is simple: attack from the water, using missiles fired from ships and America's huge fleet of jets to cow Iran into submission quickly. Week 7. Raisi expected all of this. He knows that Iran can't match the United States in terms of pure firepower. Its stock of 121 combat-ready fighter jets, along with 15 attack-type planes, will be overwhelmed by those flying from America's air carriers. If the US brings more carriers to the Persian Gulf, they'll gain full air superiority. But Raisi is far from being out of ideas. He's not looking to go toe-to-toe in a fight with the United States. He wants to use their aggression against them. After all, as accurate as American missile strikes may be, they're far from perfect. No concerted missile strikes are. Iranian civilians are already dying in blasts, images that Raisi is all too willing to use for propaganda purposes to strengthen the will of his people. Raisi also has China and Russia on his side, albeit not directly. China in particular is heavily dependent on the Strait of Hormuz for many of its goods. Though it won't pick a fight with the United States, Beijing has already started placing pressure on Washington to find a peaceful solution. Russia is also calling for restraint, arguing that an entire country shouldn't be punished for the actions of radicals. Raisi also benefits from both China and Russia having veto power as members of the United Nations or UN Security Council. Both use their vetoes, preventing the United States from obtaining global political legitimacy for the war via the UN. All of the while, Iran is spreading more chaos throughout the Middle East through its proxies. Hamas and Hezbollah maintain their focus on Israel, while the Houthis in Yemen grow ever bolder in their attacks on the Red Sea. The US has to divert at least some of its naval forces to that area. Though that won't be enough to substantially weaken its presence in the Persian Gulf, it allows Raisi to cast the United States as the controlling influence over the Middle East that he has always claimed it to be. Attacks also start occurring in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. The Houthis play a part in the attacks on the latter, with funds and equipment having already been funneled out of Iran to allow for their attacks on Saudi airports and energy plants. Raisi is gambling. If he wins, he could induce a war weariness in the United States quickly, as well as use his proxy attacks to make Saudi Arabia and the UAE withdraw their support for America. Month 2. Biden sees that the war is already at a sort of stalemate. Iran is baiting the United States to invade its mainland, an action that Biden knows is extremely risky. If the US were to throw its full force into that invasion, it's inevitable that hundreds of thousands of people, both troops and civilians, will die. He also knows that the Iranian people have been galvanized against the US due to civilians having already died in American missile strikes. Even if the US takes Iran, absorbing all of the bloodshed that would involve, he sees the potential for leaving a power vacuum. Insurgent groups would splinter off and continue fighting in the country, resulting in America potentially facing a similar situation to what it saw in Afghanistan. But still, the US can't stay in its holding pattern forever. It's holding the Persian Gulf easily and has even taken steps to reopen the Strait of Hormuz to try and keep Beijing happy. Daily missile volleys and airstrikes are being conducted on Iranian targets, slowly whittling away at the strength of Iran's war machine. But Iran won't capitulate unless it faces the full power of an American invasion. And while the US holds the Persian Gulf, Iran's proxies are conducting terror attacks throughout Europe and Africa. If the situation isn't resolved soon, the US may have a global conflict on its hands, with other nations looking to it to help them fight against Iran-backed insurgents on their territory, spreading the country's resources even thinner. Iran is also making America's naval and air assaults costly. The country is more than capable of sinking ships using missiles fired from the mainland, with the US having lost over a dozen since it took control of the Persian Gulf. Biden is left with a choice. Does he listen to the many voices in the United States that are screaming for revenge following the terror attacks that engulfed the nation just 2 months before? If he does, that would mean committing well over 1 million soldiers to a ground invasion, almost 10 times that needed for the war in Iraq, and absorbing massive military costs. And even if the US wins that ground war, it would have to commit even more resources to controlling Iran. Or does he open a channel of communication with Raisi, which is something the US hasn't really had for years given its lack of physical embassy inside Iran, to negotiate the end of the war? That could result in his own people seeing him as weak, even given the attacks he's already launched on Iran, but it could also save the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. Month 3. Biden chooses the middle ground. America begins funneling troops into Iran via the southwest, with air support provided by its fighters and helicopters, enabling landings even amidst Iran's anti-air and anti-ship defenses. But at the same time, he opens communication with Raisi. He calls Raisi's bluff. Biden tells Raisi as much during their conversations, pointing out that the ground war will be more costly to Iran than the US. He lays everything out. Yes, the United States will lose troops and equipment in the fighting, but Iran will lose more. Slowly but surely, the United States will whittle away at Iran, taking cities and working its way to Tehran, where it will ultimately depose Raisi. Is that what he wants? Raisi had hoped for a conversation, but he believed it would be a one or the other situation. Even as he speaks with Biden, American troops are fighting their way further inland. His only option now, both to preserve Iran and maintain his leadership, is to compromise. He argues for the United States to re-enter the Iran nuclear deal, something that 72% of Americans supported before his country's attacks. He also tells Biden that he should cease America's support for Israel, leaving the country to fend for itself against Iran's proxies. Biden is prepared to do the former, but won't do the latter. Israel has long been an ally of the United States, but he can encourage Israel to come to the table and potentially negotiate a ceasefire of its own. He also tells Raisi that his proxies need to stop attacking commercial vessels in the Red Sea and that the Strait of Hormuz needs to be reopened for business. He also seeks promises. If Israel is to come to the negotiating table, Iran needs to approach the discussions without threats of fighting. Plus, American troops need to be guaranteed safe passage back out of Iran. Just one attack will be enough of a spark to reignite the conflict. Diplomacy has to win the day. Raisi contemplates his options and ultimately accepts Biden's proposal. The conflict isn't over, as relations with Iran are still in the balance. But Biden is at least able to start withdrawing American troops from Iran and has avoided getting the country sucked back into a Middle Eastern crisis that it's already too war-weary to control. Still, this is just one of the many ways that a war between the United States and Iran could go. And frankly, this may be the most optimistic of the scenarios available, especially when compared to the violence and bloodshed that would erupt from a full ground invasion. But what do you think? How would the war play out differently if the US committed to a ground-based assault? Could America take Iran and keep control of it? Or would a country that's been described as a fortress draw out the conflict until the United States withdrew? Tell us what you think in the comments section. Now go and check out how the US will start a war with Iran for attacking Israel, or click this other video instead. With the amount of lethal aid that the US is delivering to Ukraine to help defend themselves against the ongoing Russian invasion, it's logical to ask, could the US conquer Russia on its own? To answer that, we need to take a closer look at both countries' militaries, compare their strengths and weaknesses,
and get clear on who is the bravest and the baddest armed force out there. Starting off with a deep dive, let's talk about nuclear power. Here's the thing. We need to accept that comparing US and Russian military power will have to exclude the use of nuclear weapons by either side. Why? Well, the US and Russia have roughly equal parity in nuclear warheads, with reportedly 5,900 total operational nuclear warheads for Russia and 5,400 for the US. Included in these stockpiles, yep, it's a tie. Russia and the US each have about 1,600 active, deployed strategic nuclear warheads. However, these numbers are just best guesses, since neither country will confirm nor deny their active nuclear forces, and only rarely will they confirm where such weapons are being kept. It's scary to be kept in the dark on this topic, right? Well, it gets scarier. Apparently, Russia claims to have a working dead hand system in place, also known as the perimeter system, that will automatically launch Russia's nuclear forces if an attempted first strike is launched to decapitate Russian leadership. While this system is supposed to be offline under normal circumstances, it's not clear when Russia has this system set to on. It's quite likely that since 2014, during Russia's earlier invasion of eastern Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula, this system may have been continually online, in order to prevent a decapitating first strike by US forces. It gets worse. Putin apparently placed Russia's entire nuclear forces on high alert in February of 2022, following the invasion of Ukraine and NATO and the West's response to support the defenders. There is no indication that the high alert status has been revoked. In fact, as of March 29, 2023, President Putin has announced that Russia will no longer give advanced warning of their nuclear weapons tests, following their February announcement that they would no longer allow the US to inspect their nuclear weapons sites as part of the decades-old START weapons treaty. With all these unsettling red flags in place, let's shift gears and take a look at other aspects of the US and Russian militaries. Who do you think has the best army, budget, and weaponry? The short answer is, there really is no comparison. The US military is currently vastly superior to anything Russia can muster. Everything we've seen from the invasion of Ukraine so far shows that the Russian Army, Navy, and Air Force have been completely overrated by Western analysts and have been manhandled expertly by Ukraine's outnumbered but valiant defenders. What's left of Russia's once vaunted military is being chewed up faster than they can replace them. But it wasn't always this way. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the US had roughly equal conventional forces, at least in numbers. The USSR had an advantage in raw numbers of tanks and artillery, especially in the areas bordering Western Europe and its NATO member countries, while the US had a larger and more advanced Air Force, Navy, and Special Forces. But since the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, the two sides have grown steadily and dramatically apart in terms of the sophistication of their tanks and aircraft, the reliability of their state-of-the-art weapon systems, and their respective capability to project power into other regions and spheres of influence. For example, Russia currently has only one working aircraft carrier, an older, fuel oil-burning ship launched in 1985 named the Admiral Kuznetsov, which, oddly enough, was built in Ukraine. This ship has suffered a string of serious accidents, from shipboard fires to repair cranes falling on its flight deck during repairs. When it does travel, it never sails far from its home port without a seagoing tug to tow it back home. It isn't even in current deployment, having been in different dry docks undergoing continual repairs since 2018, and it's known to leave an incredibly dark trail of dense smoke due to an inability for its boilers to fully burn its low-grade fuel. The whole ship is an embarrassment to the world's navies, yet it's the largest capital ship Russia still has afloat, so they'll do anything to try and keep it going. You might see it back on the high seas in 2024, maybe. In comparison, the United States is completing its second carrier in the Ford class, the most advanced and largest aircraft carrier class in the world. The US Navy currently operates 11 carrier strike groups, each of which is built around a nuclear-powered carrier. Each of these strike groups incorporates multiple ships that includes Aegis-class carriers, nuclear-powered attack submarines, destroyers, minesweepers, and additional support and resupply ships. Each Ford-class carrier will be able to support more than 75 aircraft, including the latest fifth-generation aircraft, the F-35C, along with state-of-the-art drones, airborne warning and surveillance aircraft. These carrier strike groups allow the US to patrol the world's oceans and project air power far from the US mainland. Russia has no equivalent capability and likely never will. The same inequality exists in their respective air forces, and it's only widening. While the US has both the F-35 and F-22 fifth-generation stealth fighters, Russia's only close to but not quite fifth-gen fighter, the Su-57, can't deploy over Ukraine for fear of being shot down. Meanwhile, the US is already making progress on the NGAD, the next-generation air dominance system, which includes new weapons, advanced sensors, networking and battle management suites, redesigned jet engines, and innovative combat drones that will be designed around a truly groundbreaking 6th-gen fighter to replace the F-22, which, even though it's being replaced, still remains the best dogfighting combat aircraft in operation. The US Navy is also working on a 6th-gen carrier-based stealth fighter under the current program name FAXX. Prototypes may already be flying, and the current Navy budget has already earmarked over $9 billion in funding for further development. On the other side of the equation, Russia claims to be working on a 5th-gen plus fighter, the Mikoyan PAK-DP, also known as the MiG-41. But so far it barely exists in reduced-sized wind tunnel mock-ups, and may not be seen as a flying prototype until sometime in the mid-2030s. Then there are the respective tank forces. The US Abrams tank may not be the world's best. Some argue that spot is taken up by the Israeli Merkava, the German Leopard 2, or the British Challenger 2. But the Abrams has been battle-tested since the First Gulf War in 1990, and has been continually upgraded and improved. Currently, the Abrams M1A2 System Enhancement Package version 4, SEP version 4, will employ 3rd-generation 3-gen FLIR, forward-looking infrared advanced optics that allow tank commanders to identify and attack targets farther away than ever before. Of course, Russian fanboys will point to the much-vaunted T-14 Armata as the best tank in the world. Except, well, where to begin? The tank was designed around the A85-3 engine, a copy of an X-shaped German engine which was never designed for tank propulsion. The tank's electronics and computer controls suffer from a lack of advanced computer chips, which under Western sanctions has been a real Achilles heel for the Russian economy. Captured Russian drones show they are so desperate for computer chips that they've resorted to using stolen Swedish traffic cameras for their guts. Without a consistent supply of computer chips, there's no way Russia can mass-produce the Armata. That wasn't bad enough. The production company for the Armata, UVZ, is busy upgrading previously mothballed T-62s and supporting the overworked T-72B3 and T-90M assembly lines. Currently, any Armatas being assembled are being done by hand. That may work for limited production Rolls-Royces and Lamborghinis, but it doesn't bode well for the implementation of a mass-produced battlefield weapons platform. Without any Armatas in Ukraine, and with a greater reliance on more outdated and poorly retrofitted Soviet-era models, the Abrams is far and away better than the vast majority of the surviving Russian tank forces. I say surviving because as of March 2023, the Russians have lost, at a bare minimum, an astounding 1,900 main battle tanks. Everything from the upgraded but still outdated T-72s to around 58 of their more modern T-90s. This means that more than half of their country's entire pre-invasion active tank force has been destroyed or captured. And this number is only what's been positively verified by Western observers like the Oryx team of open-source analysts. According to the London-based International Institute for Strategic Studies, the total could be anywhere from 20% to 40% higher. Russia is so desperate for replacement tanks that they're even bringing in not just the T-62s from their mothballed tank graveyards, but as of March 23, 2023, even some 75-year-old T-54s and 55s. That would be like the US bringing back its Korean War-era M47 and M48 patterns. The bad news doesn't stop there. Russia has also lost around 800 infantry fighting vehicles, lightly armored trucks and transports, 2,200 armored fighting vehicles like the various MBT, MBD, and BTR models, 230 mobile command posts and communication units, 300 engineering vehicles, 190 towed artillery pieces, 370 self-propelled artillery, 190 multiple rocket launchers (MLRS), 100 surface-to-air systems, 2,300 unarmored transports, jeeps, and other vehicles. Honestly, at this point, it's almost easier to count which tanks and vehicles Russia has left, rather than try to keep up with the ones they've lost. And again, all of this has happened not against NATO or the US directly, but against much smaller Ukraine, and in just over a year. The Russian Air Force, when it's deigned to make an appearance over the battlefield, has also suffered unusually high casualties. It's estimated that 6 to 8% of its active tactical combat aircraft have been destroyed, including around 15% of its pre-invasion multi-role and ground attack aircraft, including the more advanced Su-30SM and Su-34. Douglas Barry, a military aviation analyst at the IISS, believes at least 20 Su-34 strike aircraft have been lost, along with 1 or 2 of their top-of-the-line Su-35s. And if you're still counting, you can tack on a minimum of 80 combat helicopters. Russia's Navy isn't doing any better. In April of 2022, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the cruiser Moskva, was sunk by Ukrainian drone attacks, though Russia at first claimed it was due to a fire started by careless smokers. Following that meme show, the frigate Admiral Makarov assumed the role of flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, but it was attacked less than a month later in May of 2022. It's not confirmed, but the Makarov might now be inoperable. All told, the Russian Navy has lost 18 ships of various sizes and has had to pull all of its ships of any value back from the western Black Sea due to fears of more air and sea drone attacks. Not a very good showing against a country that officially has no navy. Then there's the overall troop losses. According to several estimates, Russia has lost as many as 200,000 to 270,000 troops, either killed, wounded, or missing, or captured in the invasion of Ukraine. And with close to 2 million men of draftable age having left the country to avoid Putin's first conscription in 2022, those troops won't be easily replaced. Neither will the hundreds of trained pilots, nor the hundreds of highly trained elite paratroopers and special forces killed in the first days of the war in the failed attack on the Hostomel airport, and in the equally disastrous attempt to assassinate President Zelensky. And because the Russian army has never created an independent, think-for-yourself NCO cadre and must be led by higher leaders who do all the thinking for the frontline troops, an astounding 14 generals have been confirmed to have died in the fighting. As of just May of 2022, Moscow had admitted that they had lost more than 300 high-ranking officers, a third of them members of the senior staff, namely colonels, lieutenant colonels, and majors. And this is only from a single year of combat against what is arguably a second-tier military, though Ukraine is punching way above its weight class. There are several reasons why Russia's military is doing so poorly. Institutional kleptocracy. Somewhere between 30% and 40% of Russia's annual military budget is siphoned off by oligarchs, commanders, and even Putin himself, who has an estimated fortune of over $200 billion. You can't expect your tank's reactive armor to operate when someone claimed to buy the explosives but instead put egg carton cardboard into the pouches where the explosives are supposed to go. Outdated tactics. With the serious degradation of its military both in numbers and quality, Russia has come to rely more and more on World War I tactics, namely massed artillery barrages and human wave attacks. The Russian commanders issue top-down commands that often bear little to no awareness of the current battlefield's logistics. This stems in part from Russia's incapability of creating an educated and well-trained NCO corps, which all other Western nations rely on. The inability to adjust. Russia seems incapable of learning from its mistakes. It's fought battles where its tanks bunched up and became easy targets for Ukrainian artillery, aided by spotter drones, or simply rolled through minefields without any concern for the consequences. We'll discuss one such example later on, in the Battle of the Seversky Donets. This rigidity is another result of a lack of a properly trained NCO corps, who might be able to adjust avenues of attack and better coordinate tactics at the point of opposition. The only element of the Russian armed forces that Putin seems able to rely on is his nuclear arm. And as we've already agreed, we're not including these in our discussions, for now at least. But Putin continues to rattle his nuclear sabers every chance he gets, as if that's the only way he can keep NATO and the US from placing boots on the ground in Ukraine. But it's clear from the battlefield that Ukraine needs no additional troops, just the advanced weaponry and ammunition that is already flowing into the country as we speak. There are 3 recent battles that showcase Russia's surprising ineptitude in modern warfare. The Battle for Antonov Airport, February 24, 2022. Within hours of President Putin's announcement of his invasion of Ukraine, his special military operation, a coordinated effort was made to land paratroopers, known as the VDV, and other special forces at Kyiv's Antonov Airport, otherwise known as the Hostomel Airport, named for the city in which it's located. An estimated 30 to 40 Russian helicopters led the airborne invasion, supported by a handful of fighter aircraft. If it had been successful, this operation would have paved the way for dozens of large Il-76 troop transports to land. Those planes would have carried thousands of reinforcements and would have then occupied a vital region within 10 kilometers of Ukraine's capital. Instead, Ukrainian resistance met the first attackers, and after the initial surprise wore off and Ukrainian mechanized reinforcements arrived, they managed to encircle the airport and eliminate at least 200 of the VDV in just a few days. Meanwhile, Ukrainian artillery cratered the runway, rendering it useless for the planned follow-on landing of the Il-76 transports. The VDV troops held on for weeks, supported by a few tanks and other vehicles that had broken through Ukrainian resistance northwest of Kyiv and had managed to link up with the Russian forces around the airfield, some of which had scattered into the nearby towns of Irpin and Bucha. However, the main column of Russian tanks and reinforcements heading south from Belarus, numbering up to 15,000 troops, never made it to the airport and was stuck in a traffic jam more than 40 kilometers long. In this ill-conceived, poorly supported and mismanaged attack, Putin wasted the best of his elite paratroops, as well as his chance for a quick, decapitating strike on the Ukrainian capital. His miscalculations of the strength and coordination of Ukrainian resistance, combined with his overconfidence about his own military's performance, were merely previews of the disasters that would unfold during the rest of his invasion of Ukraine. The Battle of the Seversky Donets. The first year of the invasion of Ukraine has displayed time and again the lack of military coordination on the part of the Russian forces, as well as their inability to adapt to the changing military environment during the heat of battle. Time and again, Russian forces will encounter an ambush, a minefield, or simply a well-prepared defense, and rather than regroup and try a different avenue of attack, will simply plow mindlessly ahead, regardless of the losses. One such event that perfectly encapsulates all the problems Russia is having with modern warfare is the well-documented disaster known as the Battle of the Seversky Donets, which occurred the 5th through the 13th of May 2022. In an effort to force a crossing of the Donets River in northeastern Ukraine, a Russian battalion tactical group, BTG, numbering between 1,000 and 1,500 troops, supported by tanks, armored personnel carriers, APCs, and artillery, placed a group of pontoons across the river near the small city of Seversky. They began to send tanks and APCs to the western side, while calling up additional vehicles on the eastern side to prepare to have them cross as well. But Ukraine had advanced warning of this attack, possibly due to satellite surveillance supplied by the US. In preparation, the Ukrainian armed forces brought up both tanks and artillery, with spotter drones overhead. When around half of the vehicles had crossed, Ukrainian artillery began pounding the two pontoon bridges already in place, isolating the forces that had already crossed. They also pounded the now massed vehicle pileup on the far side of the river, destroying a vast number of frontline combat vehicles. Rather than give up against a prepared and alert defensive formation, Russian commanders just continued to feed more forces into the cauldron. Some Russian military bloggers went beyond calling these decisions inept and suicidal and deemed them instead to be sabotage. When the surviving units finally pulled back the following week, Russia had lost over 70 tanks and other vehicles, and by some accounts more than 1,000 troops killed, wounded, and missing. Retired British Major General Mick Ryan estimated that the defeat likely resulted in not just a BTG, but probably an entire brigade losing a large part of its combat power. While most Western militaries would see such a calamity as a reason to learn from such mistakes, the Russian command structure doesn't seem to know how to make adjustments. Additional major defeats where Russia seemed heedless of massive casualties occurred at regular intervals across the Ukrainian battlefield, including Kherson, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, and Volodar, not to mention the estimated 30 to 50,000 casualties Russia may have suffered in their months-long struggle to capture the fortified region around Bakhmut. Many observers will say that the Russian-Ukrainian war might not be a fair comparison to a possible Russian-US military encounter. Isn't there some event that would provide a better metric to compare the opposing militaries? As a matter of fact, there is. The so-called Battle for the Konoko Fields, also known as the Battle of Kashan, which occurred in Syria in 2018. This was the first hot encounter between US and Russian forces since the Cold War. The US had stationed a handful of US Marines and Army Special Forces about 5 miles east of the Euphrates River. close to a vital oil drilling and pumping station in eastern Syria to help support a small group of Syrian Democratic Forces (SDF) fighters, also defending the site primarily against ISIS threats in the region. Russian and US forces had previously agreed that a nominal dividing line between the two forces would be the Euphrates River. They had even set up a special hotline between the two areas' command units to make sure there wouldn't be any confusion on the ground, as the Russian troops were also ostensibly opposed to ISIS at the time. At around 5 a.m. on February 7, 2018, a force of some 250 mixed Russian Wagner mercenaries and Syrian pro-government militia attempted to cross the Euphrates southwest of Qashm. US forces fired a few artillery rounds to warn them off, and they did pull back. But later in the evening around 10 p.m., the US troops were surprised to detect a column of Russian T-72 tanks and support vehicles, along with as many as 500 soldiers, heading towards their position from the east side of the Euphrates. Sporadic artillery fire and mortar fire began to hit their positions as well. The US troops followed procedure and contacted their opposite numbers using the predetermined hotline, but the Russian commanders assured them that there were no Russian troops in the area. With that reassurance, the US troops called in massive air and artillery support involving F-15E and F-22 fighter jets, B-52 bombers, AC-130 gunships, AH-64 Apache attack helicopters, MQ-9 Reaper and RQ-7B Shadow drones, in addition to M777 howitzer artillery and M142 HIMARS rockets. The Russian and Syrian forces never got to within rifle range of their US targets. 4 hours later, when the fighting was over, more than 100 of the attacking forces had been killed, though some estimates put that loss at closer to 330. The only casualties on the US SDF side was a single wounded SDF soldier. The lopsided nature of the encounter, due to primarily the overwhelming and accurately directed air and artillery strikes supplied by the US, underscored the uneven nature of the current US and Russian military forces, as well as their relative abilities to use combined arms in a coordinated fashion. The massive response was also seen as a deliberate warning to Russia not to take the US or their allies lightly. That leads us inescapably to another interesting question. Could the US on its own invade and conquer the country of Russia? Alternatively, could the US, with NATO's help, conquer Russia? Bluntly, right now there's no way the US, even with NATO's help, could physically invade and conquer Russia. Even if Russia failed to use their nukes, and you can be certain they would, there's simply no way the vast country of Russia, stretching through 11 time zones, could ever be fully occupied and pacified. Hold on though, let's break this answer down and then we can talk about some other ways the US could possibly, actually, very probably destroy Russia. It's becoming clear in the modern age that no moderately well-supplied country would be able to be occupied and defeated as long as their people maintained the will to fight. A perfect example is the relatively tiny country of Vietnam. They were one of the first countries to soundly defeat the Mongol Empire in the 13th century and resisted French occupation right up until the Japanese invaded them in 1940. After the fall of Japan in 1945, they went on the offensive to drive the French out of their country. And when they were successful and the US tried to defend the area of South Vietnam, they fought for more than a decade before driving the US out as well, despite suffering as many as 1 million casualties. Cambodia next thought they could occupy Vietnam's Mekong Delta, but in a mere 2 weeks, the Vietnamese routed the attackers and occupied the capital, Phnom Penh, which they held until 1988. China then invaded, thinking that they could impose their will on the ruling Vietnamese government. But the Vietnamese went toe-to-toe with the mighty Chinese army and after some brief but intense fighting, managed to force them to withdraw, though China considered the event merely a short, punitive expedition. Such determination to defend one's homeland would undoubtedly be faced in Russia as well, but of an order of magnitude far greater. Many segments of Russia see the current invasion of Ukraine and the implied aim of NATO to hang a strategic defeat around Putin's neck as one of an existential crisis for their country. Since Russian media is nothing more than an echo chamber for their dictator-in-chief, most commentators mirror Putin's own comments when he says that in light of such a defeat, "I do not even know if such an ethnic group as the Russian people will be able to survive in the form in which it exists today." You can expect that, just as they did with their Herculean efforts to defend their country against the onslaught of Nazi Germany in World War II, Russia will fight on against any invasion, no matter the costs, the consequences, or the forces arrayed against them. They might even find a willing ally in China, who has been eyeing sections of Russia's Far East territories around Vladivostok that as recently as the 1850s were part of Greater China. it's entirely possible that China would be willing to help support the defense of Russia in exchange for what they currently consider historical Chinese territory. There is evidence that China has decided it's in their best interest to keep Russia as an intact nation in order to divide Western opposition. Both countries share an intense dislike of what they perceived as US hegemony throughout the world, and now that Russia has seen its oil and natural gas outlets in the West curtailed by sanctions, by necessity, they've had to turn to China and India as their two primary sources for exploiting petrochemicals. Even closer cooperation in the future is only inevitable. But wait, there's one more option. What if the US managed to topple the Russian government? This may be the trickiest of the three topics to answer. In short, yes, the US could probably topple the Putin government at any time if they wanted to. There was a recent event that showcased just how precise US strikes have become, an event that may have led Putin to decide to travel in a special armored train and to spend much of his time in isolated bunkers in Siberia, far from the active front lines. On August 2, 2022, the US sent a pair of specially modified Hellfire missiles to take out Ayman al-Zawahiri, one of the al-Qaeda leaders responsible for planning various attacks on US and Western targets, including the 9/11 attacks, the bombing of the USS Cole, multiple bombings of US embassies in Africa, and others. He was tracked to a residence in Kabul, in the middle of a densely populated area. But the two drones were so precise that the US claimed Zawahiri was the only casualty of the operation. According to published reports, he was taken out while he stood on the second-floor balcony of the residence with the missiles equipped with Ginsu knife-like projections. The strike was publicized in a series of press conferences, with additional US government officials warning that no matter how long it takes, no matter where you hide, if you are a threat to our people, the United States will find you and take you out. No doubt Putin took that threat seriously. But US military and diplomatic policy has matured since the 1950s and 60s, when the CIA routinely toppled governments, many of them democratically elected, in countries like Iran, South Vietnam, Chile, Guatemala, the Congo, and others. Nowadays, the US prefers to let its military-industrial complex do the talking, such as when they toppled Saddam's regime in Iraq. In retrospect, despite the overwhelming military victory the US achieved, the end result was ultimately seen by many as seriously flawed, as the US had no plan to replace the removed Iraqi government with any kind of stable and reliable replacement. And that may be the one main reason why the US doesn't want to topple the Putin dictatorship. There are fears that whoever might replace him could be far worse. The one element of his arsenal that Putin has dared not yet use is his nuclear arsenal. He probably knows that as long as he doesn't employ nukes, then the West will worry he's the only thing holding back a massive nuclear war. He's betting that the US and the West will worry that whoever comes next might not hold back. And so, we've come full circle. It's clear that the one ace in the hole that Russia still holds onto is its nuclear deterrent. Putin dare not use them, for fear that doing so will unleash a horrific response from the West. But Putin has to threaten to use them in fear that their possible use is the only thing keeping NATO from sending actual troops to drive the Russian invaders out of Ukraine. And the West dare not take Putin out directly, for fear that his replacement might be willing to use nukes in an act of suicidal revenge. And so the world balances on a precarious knife's edge, closer to a nuclear holocaust than we've been since the Cuban Missile Crisis of the early 1960s. It would be best if all sides could take one giant step back from the precipice, but Putin seems incapable of backing down, and the brave Ukrainians are determined to take their country back, as well they should. The most likely outcome is that some oligarch will find a willing accomplice in Putin's cook staff, and the Russian president will succumb to a bout of severe intestinal distress, following which some level-headed replacement will endeavor to repair the massive damage Putin's done both to Ukraine and to his own country. At least, that's what many sane people hope. Don't forget, before he was the leader of the Wagner Group, the oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin had a very special nickname, Putin's chef. But what do you think? Could the US military conquer Russia all on its own? How would they do it? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Throughout the 21st century, Russia and China's economic ties have openly deepened. However, the relationship between these two superpowers is a strenuous one, and it wouldn't take much to make them mortal enemies. What would it take? And if either of these two countries did attack each other, what would prompt them to do so? And who would win? While neither country is willing to admit the reality of their relationship, the signs are there. To understand them, we need to delve into their geopolitical histories. Both countries have long traditions rich in warfare and attempts to claim superiority in their respective regions. For Russia, that's the Great Eurasian Steppe. Russia's historical ties to the steppe can be traced back to its origins as an Eastern Slavic country. However, the geography of northeastern Europe is steeped in low-lying flatland that is incredibly difficult to defend against invaders due to its sheer size and exposure. And Russia has been on the receiving end of many invasions, with perhaps the most notable being the Napoleonic Wars. Although Russia fended off the French, it showcased the relative ease with which the European part of Russia could be attacked via the Germanic lands. That's why Russia has spent considerable resources to secure its European borders and relations, which came to a head in the 20th century with the USSR. Apart from being at its peak territorially, Russia held diplomatic ties with most of Eastern Europe through the Warsaw Pact, which elevated its influence over most of the Eurasian steppe. But the situation didn't last. With the USSR dissolving and many European countries joining the US-led NATO, Russia's borders of influence were equated to its actual borders, perilously close to the country's main population centers in Europe. China's territory has ebbed and flowed over the millennia. China's current policy seems focused on claiming parts of territories it has historically owned, including but not limited to Taiwan, parts of India in the Himalayas, and swathes of the South China Sea. These territorial disputes have brought the US and several Indo-Pacific countries together to form the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, QSD or the Quad, to curb China's influence in the area. The main thorn in China's internal and external diplomacy is Taiwan, technically led by the Republic of China, which it considers a rebellious remnant of the country that needs to be brought back into the fold. However, Taiwan has the military and diplomatic backing of the US. If China decided to abandon diplomacy and invade Taiwan, it would be no doubt met by US-armed Taiwanese forces, with the rest of the Quad following close behind. This would likely create a prolonged war similar to the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian conflict. Further complicating China's foreign policy is its robust yet fragile domestic industry. As a country with the second largest population on Earth, China is woefully lacking in natural resources to support that many people working and producing for the economy. China imports most of its oil and natural gas, as well as mineral, drinking water, and timber. What makes the US particularly dangerous to China's economy is the fact that most of its oil and natural gas supplies come through shipments from the Persian Gulf. Furthermore, a vast majority of this sea traffic has to pass through the tightly controlled Strait of Malacca. To salvage the situation, China claims most of the South China Sea, almost up to the strait itself, and opposes most other countries with access to the ocean. Still, if China decided to attack Taiwan or seriously try to control its portions of the South or East China Sea, it would no doubt be opposed by the Indo-Pacific countries. As a result, the strait would likely be shut off to Chinese vessels. This would cripple the Chinese resource-demanding economy and would likely result in the country's collapse as we know it, with unfathomable consequences for world politics. With opposition from all sides, it would seem natural that Russia and China would become allies, in an attempt to curb the American influence on its borders. NATO for Russia, the Quad for China. However, this is the point where history gets complex. You see, while China and Russia are currently presenting a united front against the US, their historical ties are more hostile than you might think. Even when both countries were communist in the mid-20th century, the regimes clashed over their interpretation of Marxism-Leninism. But the most contested Chinese-Russian relations are due to two treaties in the mid-19th century. During the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, Imperial China was under heavy political, diplomatic, and military pressure from colonial and foreign imperial forces, starting with the Opium Wars and ending with the country's reinvention as the Communist People's Republic of China. The 110 years of opposition from the West has been dubbed as the Century of Humiliation by the Chinese, with many politicians repeatedly citing all the losses China suffered during that period. As part of the Century of Humiliation, China was forced to sign several so-called unequal treaties, in which China had to cede parts of its territory, control, or other diplomatic material. With Russia in particular, the two most important treaties were the 1858 Treaty of Aigun and the 1860 Treaty of Peking, which resulted in China losing the province of Outer Manchuria. While Chinese officials claim that the province isn't a point of contention, reality begs to differ. The division made by the two treaties was somewhat ambiguous, resorting to using the two main rivers in the region, Amur and Ussuri, as borders between Russia and China. However, Russia claims that all the islands in the river belong to Russia, while China claims that the border goes through the middle of the rivers, assigning the islands to a country based on its location against the middle of the river. In fact, the entire area has been hotly contested by China. Even in the 20th century, a 7-month military conflict between the Chinese and the Russians took place over the contested islands, particularly the Zhenbao or Damansky Island on the Ussuri. The 2-week battle over Zhenbao resulted in hundreds of casualties on both sides and created more than 3.5 decades of tension over the islands. Furthermore, the sedimentary island, called Bolshoi Ussuriski Island or Haiksazi Island, has also been a sore spot in China's history. It stands in the confluence of the rivers, right on the border between the two countries. Claims over the island's territory have been going on since the treaties. Eventually, the two countries ratified the control of the island in a 2004 agreement that split the island between them and permitted China to use the Amur and Ussur rivers for ship traffic. However, it seems China hasn't caught up to the agreement just yet. In a map published in 2023, China displayed the entirety of the Bolshoi Ussuriski Island as being under Chinese control. While this may have been an oversight, it could also mean that China has plans regarding the previously debated region. The island itself is an undeveloped piece of land and would be an afterthought were it not for its favorable geographical position. Lying at the confluence of Amur and Ussuri, the island is perilously close to Khabarovsk, the second-largest city in Outer Manchuria, which overlooks the island. Since Russia controls the portion of the island on the confluence of Amur and Ussuri, it can also control the shipping routes that are usable when the river isn't iced over. The Amur also has considerable hydroelectric and fishing capacity, something that China could greatly use due to its reliance on energy imports. Additionally, China's Ministry of Natural Resources has issued a statement relabeling cities and provinces in the Outer Manchuria region, which belongs to Russia, with Chinese names, usually historical ones from before the treaties. While it might seem that the region is relatively useless to China, you have to keep the bigger picture in mind. Outer Manchuria is one of the most populated and industrialized regions of the Russian Far East, with 2 cities having over 600,000 inhabitants, Khabarovsk and Vladivostok. The region is inhabited by around 4 million people, half of the entire Russian Far East population, compared to over 100 million people in the neighboring Chinese provinces. If war were to break out, China would have a massive initial manpower advantage, and the people could easily inhabit the sparsely populated Russian region after the fact. What makes Outer Manchuria a possible first front of the Sino-Russo War is also the aforementioned fact that China is a relatively resource-deprived nation. Since there are roughly 1 billion people in the country, China has a massive resource demand for energy, minerals, and even drinking water. Currently, most of the country, even though it contains some of the biggest rivers in the world, can barely produce enough to satisfy the population's need. Additionally, the biggest population center in the North China Plain has pretty much no natural drinking water supply, relying on the rest of the country and imports for its drinking water sources. As a result, China is looking for ready water supplies elsewhere, with 2 lucrative options: India and Russia. With pre-existing territorial disputes with India, China could potentially look into invading the water-rich Himalayan region it stakes a claim to. However, India itself houses the largest population in the world and faces a similar water scarcity problem, relying on the same region for drinking water. This makes the country much more defensive of the contested territory. Add to that the fact that India is in the Quad and also has beneficial trade relations with the West, and the US, Quad, and NATO would come down hard on China if it started an invasion on Indian soil. This leaves Russia as one of the key interest points for acquiring more resources. In terms of drinking water, Siberia is generally river-rich. However, by far the largest concentration of drinking water is in Lake Baikal, the biggest lake by volume, outstripping all Great Lakes combined, with estimates suggesting it could support the world population for decades by itself. In fact, a Chinese company aggressively purchased land around the lake in the 2010s, with plans to construct a pipeline and supply China with fresh water in 2017. The local population protested about the construction, and the Russian government intervened, forcing the Chinese company to abandon any plans to build up Lake Baikal. This doesn't mean that China will keel over. With its economy highly dependent on resources that it currently needs to import, and much of its oil and natural gas imports coming from either the Strait of Malacca or Russia itself, China might look to remove one of the middlemen from the equation. Since its south is bound in overseas territorial disputes and influenced by US foreign policies, Russia might be the next obvious choice. With Outer Manchuria as the entryway, China could gain access to the entire Siberian region, which is rich in oil, natural gas, minerals, timber, and water. All the resources the country desperately needs to function. Furthermore, with the Russian Far East so far removed from the population and influence centers in Europe, and the Russian army currently embroiled in its own war with Ukraine, China could consider invading Russia at any moment. This way, Beijing would gain the upper hand and succeed in a quick war, the kind Putin previously failed to accomplish in Ukraine 2 years prior. Remember, most of the issues that Russia is facing right now in Ukraine are due to intervention from NATO countries. The same issues that likely won't provide Russia with any assistance against China. However, a Chinese invasion might prompt the US and the Quad to exercise their own plans to cut off China in the south, possibly creating a chain reaction of war declarations similar to that of the World Wars. Additionally, Outer Manchuria, and the Siberian region by extension, would provide China with greater access to the Pacific coastline through the Sea of Japan or the Russian Pacific coastline itself. In fact, if China were determined to bring the entirety of the Russian Far East under its own control, it could gain access to the Arctic shore itself. This is vital for an entirely different reason. You see, the main shipping routes around Eurasia and Africa currently rely on the Suez Canal and the Strait of Hormuz, followed by the Strait of Malacca to transport goods between Western Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Alternatively to the Suez-Hormuz line would be the Cape of Good Hope, southern Horn of Africa, a route that is around 4,000 nautical miles longer. But the Arctic contains a sea and a lot of ice that's navigable for at least a part of the year during warmer months when the ice cover is smaller. While the Arctic was previously relatively unused for maritime transport for that reason, global warming has changed the situation rapidly. A change of even a few degrees Celsius has been enough to drastically reduce the ice sheet over the Arctic Circle and open up previously inaccessible waters to ships. The Russian-controlled Northern Sea route is currently the biggest and the shortest trading route in the region, with the other option going through the Northwest route in Alaskan and Canadian waters. According to some studies, Arctic routes could be between 30 and 50% shorter, either in time spent at sea or distance, than those using the Suez or Panama canals, while eliminating the possible bottlenecks at the two artificial channels, a fact that became painfully obvious in the Evergreen incident in 2021. The tenuous geopolitics in Russia leave it open for influence from both the West, with which it is in a proxy war through Ukraine, and China, where it sells oil, gas, and other resources for the much-needed capital to fuel its economy and military efforts. The current situation plays well into China's hands, giving them unparalleled reach into Siberia through ongoing trade, all without actually needing to invest resources in invading the country or forcing Russia to accept the deal. With Russia stuck in a prolonged war it seemingly has no way of getting out of, it was forced to sell oil and gas to China at roughly half the rate it did to European countries. Naturally, this gives China a clear economic benefit from the Russo-Ukrainian war. As such, it works in China's favor to have Russia occupy the US and EU military efforts into Ukraine, while at the same time siphoning the resources it needs from Russia without resorting to trade through the Strait of Malacca. This has led to China famously not condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine and abstaining in any peace talks or dialogues to end the war in the region. It's quite clear that Putin's regime is working out well for China, and the country will likely remain a stern ally so long as the situation doesn't change. Furthermore, while the previous 2 years might have led everyone to believe Russia has a robust economy and is a veritable superpower in its own right, the truth is a bit more nuanced. Russia's population is roughly 1/10 of China's, and while the countries have a comparable GDP, gross domestic product, per capita, China's size gives it a clear edge. In fact, in current estimates, China is the world's second largest economy, while Russia makes it to 11th place by total GDP. The economic disparity and Russia's military, economic, and diplomatic losses that followed the invasion of Ukraine make any deals fall naturally in China's favor. So long as Russia is cut off from the rest of the world financially, it's forced to accept China's terms in order to sell its resources and power its economy. However, the melting Arctic ice might put a dent in that plan. If Russia were able to operate independent shipping year-round and impose tariffs on goods traveling through the northeast route, it could create a secondary stream of income and gain a semblance of economic independence from China. Additionally, just because Russia's current regime is favorable to China doesn't mean that the situation will stay that way. The war in Ukraine might be protracted, but it won't last forever, and Russia might reconsider its allegiance to China in the long run and cut off resource export to China from its Far East. Many experts believe that Russia doesn't have the military power to press further into Ukraine in 2024. With Ukraine steadily holding on to the support it receives from the EU and NATO, the war might be reaching a breaking point within the next few years. While there are a few possibilities on how the war will end, one of the predictions is that Russia's current regime will collapse. This will pave the way for a different leadership, with a potentially revolutionary outlook on Russia's long-term future in both Europe and Asia. The leadership might align itself more with Europe, China, or a third party altogether, and some of those scenarios might stop it from playing right into China's hands. If Russia does end up weakened enough from the Ukrainian war or start opposing its ongoing trade with China, then China wouldn't have many options left. Since the current regime under Xi is fervently opposed to the influence radiating from the US onto the Indo-Pacific, the resource-starved Chinese will need to obtain more goods from its north, i.e. Russia. This circles back to the seemingly solved dispute between Russia and China on the matter of which country controls parts of Outer Manchuria. While China has gained back most of the territories it lost during the century of humiliation, the provinces of Outer Manchuria are still under Russian control. Given that China is still pressing claims on areas it had long lost any legal ties on and are loosely historically connected to China, such as the claims in the South China Sea, it's highly likely to reverse course on its previous agreements with Russia and claim back the lost provinces in Manchuria. Considering the present economic and demographic inequality between the regions separated by the Amur and Ussuri, China's invasion would likely be swift and deadly. In all likelihood, it would displace or culturally assimilate the Russians in the area before reinforcements from the European parts of Russia could arrive. Since the area is already starting to be influenced by China due to ongoing trade, it's also possible that China might imitate the Russian annexation of Crimea to gain access to the Japanese Sea. Alternatively, it might begin its advance into the rest of the Russian Far East. In essence, what is currently happening in Ukraine could be repeated. In the way Russia wants to diversify its port access and limit the influence of other countries on its economy, China could do the same thing in the future to Russia. With Russia weakened from the war, it's unlikely to remain the world's 11th economy for long and will likely be shattered by conflicting ideologies from within. That would leave Russia underpopulated, underrepresented, and underdeveloped. Yet the resource-rich and highly lucrative Far East will be ripe for the taking by the country that stands to gain the most from utilizing those resources: China. The only question that remains is how China will actually attack Russia. While China's current policy is non-interference, the country could reverse that course and try to sponsor a deal between Russia and Ukraine. During peace accords, China may impose its own influence on both Russia and Ukraine, forcing either country to accept whatever terms China deems best for its own agenda. In exchange, China would fund reconstruction and reinvigoration efforts in the war-struck areas of Ukraine. On the surface, the EU would likely welcome this deal, as Ukraine's reconstruction efforts are most likely going to be funded by the EU. Talks about the country joining the EU in an expedited process have been underway for some time. This would also suit China's plans to undercut the US influence around the world. If the EU doesn't have to support yet another country and can rely on Chinese-brought infrastructure in Ukraine, the US doesn't have as much leverage. While the EU is currently importing Norwegian and American oil and gas, the end of the Russo-Ukrainian war could drastically change the trading routes on a global scale. With Russia free to resume exporting oil and gas to Europe, the US will lose one of its biggest export partners. It's currently unknown whether Russia can actually satisfy the needs of both China and the EU, but China could support the trade if it retains its influence on Russian politics and economy. Even if China doesn't create a lucrative offer to end the Russo-Ukrainian war, it could end the war forcefully by pulling the plug on economically supporting Russia. While Russia would likely retaliate by cutting off the resources from Siberia, China could open up claims to Outer Manchuria as a proxy. By invading Russia, it can take hold of the resources itself and cut out the middleman from the equation. Before long, China could feasibly gain access to the Sea of Japan or even freezing Siberian ports in the Arctic, allowing it to bypass the Strait of Malacca and place its products directly into Western Europe. In the end, while Russia and China's current stance is that the countries have an alliance, in actuality, Russia is only a few steps away from becoming China's vassal or being attacked by China's numerically superior forces while being completely unprotected from Europe. Then it's up to China to decide what claims it would pursue, and to the US and the rest of the Quad to determine how to proceed in creating a new world order. It should be mentioned that all of these scenarios are only rough approximations or conjectures. Each one is based on the current events in Russia, Ukraine, and the geopolitics surrounding the China-US rivalry in the Indo-Pacific. If something drastically changes in the foreign policies of either of the parties, China could be facing a much worse war against the entirety of the US and the Quad before it strikes against Russia. But what do you think? Is China going to attack Russia, or is it still too afraid of American countermeasures? In the event China does attack, will it press far into Siberia or settle by regaining the region of Outer Manchuria? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more military content from military experts.
Going into war isn't always a choice. More often than not, it's a necessity. And even with NATO's support of Ukrainian independence, it seems like Putin is leaving the US less and less choice in the decision of whether or not to get more actively involved in the war in Ukraine. But if the US had to suddenly engage in a full-scale war against Russia, how would it fare? What plans is it making for such an eventuality? One thing is for sure, Putin had better buckle up. The US military keeps its M1 Abrams oiled up, its Tomahawks loaded, and its star-spangled heroes capes nearby all year round. It is always prepared and has kept a particularly close watch on the former Soviet Union ever since the 1940s. During the Cold War, the West had it easy. Despite communist coups and the proxy wars, the Americans and their NATO allies always knew exactly who the real threat was, the foe pulling the strings behind the scenes, if you will. It was, of course, the Soviet Union. For 45 years, the West had prepared, strategized, and planned for the ultimate eventuality, an all-out military confrontation with the Soviet superpower. Whether the Cold War conflict went hot by spiraling into the nuclear realm, or if kinetic operations remained firmly moored in the familiar bounds of conventional warfare, made little difference. What mattered most was that the enemy and its intentions were clear. Knowing that is half the battle. But what happened next changed everything. The Soviet collapse in the early 1990s kick-started 3 decades of self-discovery as the US spread its wings as the world's sole superpower. Combating terrorists, genocidal dictators, and non-state tyrants became the order of the day. NATO members drifted apart, the alliance's mission and purpose suddenly cast into doubt. Then came a 2-decade forever war in the Middle East. We all know how that turned out. After a decade of strategic revision, the US finally embarked on a wholesale pivot to Asia, now hoping to contain a Chinese threat which had for decades grown stronger, almost in plain sight. And then February 2022 happened. Russia invaded Ukraine. Geopolitical clarity, it seemed, was restored. The aggressive Russian bear, whose foreign policy since the Soviet collapse had vacillated somewhere between bitter Western resentment and surprising Western rapprochement, showed its true colors. America, firmly committed to bolstering its presence in the Indo-Pacific, nevertheless seized the opportunity in Europe. For years it had been nursing its wounds, trying to restore European partnerships and alliances which had slowly atrophied under the pressure of populist politics. The invasion recast these relationships in stone. Everyone in the Western world suddenly saw the reflection of their own histories in Ukraine's existential fight for its independence. The US and its Western allies pledged collective action: sanctions, hybrid warfare, material donations, refugee support, and military training. Everything short of entering the fight themselves. This Western support coalition has shown no signs of weakening now, more than a year into the war. If Finland's recent accession to NATO says anything, it has only grown stronger. What is this all leading to? For the Americans, who for a decade could not drum up the political unity required to deal with Russian revisionism, the Russian threat is credible once more. The pivot to Asia will continue apace. But now, with Eastern European sovereignty under threat once more, America must continue to do everything in its power to prepare it and its European allies for the ultimate eventuality, a full-scale war with Russia. We know you're probably laughing right about now. War with Russia, you're saying. The same Russia that can barely make inroads against a country 28 times smaller and with 100 million fewer people than itself. The same Russia that has allegedly already suffered 250,000 casualties in a single year of fighting, more than the entire number of Russian soldiers killed in every war the Soviet Union and Russia fought since World War II combined. Well, yeah, that Russia. As counterintuitive as it now seems, Russia still poses a grave threat to Eurasian security and Western values the world over. Western analysts are contemplating a number of contingencies that could result from the war in Ukraine.
which fortunately for us all has thus far remained contained to a single country. The major one is the potentiality that Russia and its fuming dictator Vladimir Putin, finally recognizing the futility of winning a long-term victory in Ukraine, go absolutely rogue. Russia has all but burned its remaining capital with the West. Politically, Putin is a global pariah. Economically, Russia has been cut off from Western markets. Its once profitable natural gas left with virtually nowhere to go. Sanctions continue to cut into its ability to supply its military and civilian population with the specialized industrial and technological parts it needs to function effectively. Militarily, there's little evidence the latest round of mobilization will provide the tactical momentum Russia needs to win over the long term. Rather, it's more likely that untrained Russian conscripts or mobiks will continue to be fed into the meat grinder to little effect. Will Putin back down? You can almost guarantee he won't. He's already raised the stakes too high. His people, his propagandists at least, expect too much of him. He's paranoid. He must deliver on his promises. The Ukrainians, as long as they live and breathe, will never accept the Russian occupation on any scale. As a final recourse, Putin still has his nuclear umbrella, something he knows the West won't gamble on. From our vantage point today, it seems as though Putin's Russia, if it continues its present course, will almost have to go rogue. It won't end the war with a negotiated settlement unless something drastic changes, but as attrition whittles down its once vaunted military power, it will be forced to engage in its antebellum tactics, only far more aggressively. It will rely on asymmetric warfare and hybrid operations to destabilize the West. It will increasingly act like a global version of its now closest remaining ally of consequence, Iran, completely decoupled from the international community, pursuing a revanchist foreign policy using drones, proxy wars, missile strikes, espionage, and more, all while using its nuclear umbrella to deter Western retaliation. Nuclear threats will continue to grow in intensity. Cyber operations will increase in kind. Putin will target vulnerable pipelines and transoceanic fiber optic cables. Russia will continue to fund and sponsor disinformation and misinformation campaigns. Russian bots named Peter and Frank will enter your feeds at election times in the hopes of trolling you into voting for their candidate of choice. The bloodletting in Ukraine will continue. The threat of escalation will remain omnipresent. And that isn't good, because as one think tank put it, a rogue Russia still represents a geopolitical crisis of the highest order. It's a threat to global security, Western political systems, the cybersphere, space, and food security, not to mention every Ukrainian civilian. Let's be clear, Ukraine has blunted, if not outright neutered, Russia's conventional military power over the past year. That feat alone is remarkable. But this war won't end anytime soon. Russia remains a dangerous foe, and elsewhere, especially outside Ukraine, the bear can still bite. Make no mistake. So where, outside Ukraine, could the US see itself fighting Russia, and how would it do so? One of the geopolitical hotspots for a possible confrontation between Russia and the US is in a random chunk of territory wedged between Lithuania and Poland, known as the Kaliningrad exclave. This sparsely populated patch of land is Russia's gateway to the Baltic, a heavily defended former German port city ceded to the Soviets in the aftermath of World War II. Kaliningrad's geography is tricky. The port is literally surrounded by NATO countries. Strategically, it's an A2AD or anti-access area denial nightmare for NATO, home to thousands of Russian forces, advanced fighter jets, and nuclear-capable Iskander-M missiles. The exclave is connected to Belarus by a narrow 40-mile land bridge known as the Suwalki Gap, which itself cuts into the only two highways and lone railroad connecting Poland to NATO's exposed Baltic states. Since NATO assets cannot traverse the Suwalki Gap without coming under the guns of Russia's military in Kaliningrad, the wide-open rural region is a crucial choke point that Russia would almost certainly exploit if it ever sought to cut off the Baltics from NATO. Finland's accession to NATO has caused tensions in this region to flare once more. In a matter of 1 year, NATO's border with Russia has doubled, adding over 800 miles of densely wooded, difficult-to-patrol tundra. The Baltic Sea has come firmly under NATO's protection. with Kaliningrad the only Russian outpost in an otherwise Western-friendly sea of states. Putin has had grievances against the West for years, and nobody, certainly not now, should bother trying to predict his next move. But prediction and preparation is the express job of America's military strategists. Were Putin to try to secure the Suwalki Gap to Kaliningrad or gain a foothold in Finland, Lithuania, Estonia, or any of its past satellites, the US and its allies must try to discern his regional capabilities and prepare for an open conflict. But what would this look like? How does the Russian way of war differentiate from the American approach? America is fortunate, at least far more fortunate than Russia in this hypothetical. Its robust network of military alliances and partnerships throughout Europe mean it would be far from alone in a war against Russia. Before the war in Ukraine, both Russia and NATO had respected the terms of the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act, committing both sides to avoid reinforcing or permanently stationing forces on the territories of the former Warsaw Pact states or their neighboring Russian borders. Russia abrogated itself from these terms when it invaded Ukraine. Now, NATO has a clear pathway to bolster its presence in these critical areas using measured multinational deployments and the increased rotation of permanently based American troops. The fact America's force posture would be complemented by the presence of British, Polish, Italian, Spanish, French, Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian, Finnish, and many other allied partners speaks to the logic of the American way of war, which in the modern era has become multinational and collaborative to the core. There is strength in numbers and resolve in collective resilience. These force multipliers are not something Russia could count on in a direct confrontation with NATO. In fact, it can only really count on direct, cooperative assistance from Belarus, and amid its attempts to keep out of the Ukraine war, Belarusian loyalty to Russia is an especially unproven commodity. While Russia has struggled to coax Belarus to fight alongside it, NATO's military personnel now exceeds 5.4 million, 4 times that of Russia. According to Statista, NATO also has about 5 times as many aircraft, 4 times as many armored vehicles, and 3 times as many military ships. Not to mention the backing of the world's biggest defense spender, the US itself, with 1.39 million troops alone, and a defense budget of $801 billion in 2021, dwarfing second-place China with a net spend of $293 billion, and Russia, who spent a paltry $65.9 billion that same year. Before Russia invaded Ukraine, each year it conducted massive multi-day military exercises demonstrating its military power. NATO has done the same, ramping up its collective exercises over the past year in response to Russian aggression. While these exercises show little more than NATO's theoretical military effectiveness, the war in Ukraine has brought Russia into stark relief, and it has certainly been found wanting. Russia is in the midst of a new military reform, something its Ministry of Defense announced at the end of 2022. Most see this as little more than a haphazard attempt to patch a sinking ship. They're trying to grow their modern military to the size it was over 2 decades ago. But today there remains a lack of specialists in charge of maintaining military equipment and vehicles, as well as military infrastructure inherited from the USSR, which no longer exists today. Additionally, there were tens of thousands of auxiliary positions like military financial officers and army construction workers, which have also ceased to exist. In other words, noted Russian military journalist and military analyst Pavel Felgenauer, the nominal size of the armed forces cannot be increased in a realistic and meaningful way. Russia lacks qualified junior officers. There's nobody to command the conscripts they're throwing into battle. The army of 1.5 million soldiers Russia dreams of is little more than a bureaucratic fantasy. Still, Russia is frantically trying to restore its depleted forces to the numbers it boasted prior to the invasion of Ukraine. It isn't working. Its armed forces today are lacking in some areas of modern military technology, including drone capability, electronic components, and radar and satellite reconnaissance, Felgenauer told the media. Yes, we have weapons, but our reconnaissance capabilities are weaker than our attack capabilities. So we have a long-range, sometimes precision-guided weapon, but we don't always know where the target is. But what if Russia went into a full-scale war with the West despite these obvious weaknesses? Let's say for the sake of argument that Putin goes rogue. He sees Finland's NATO membership as the final straw. He still doubts the West will risk starting World War III. and he is desperate for a quick victory in Europe. He throws everything into the Ukrainian cauldron, and it all goes wrong. Armed with Western tanks and eventually aircraft, Ukraine mounts a series of counteroffensives that all but push back Russia to its own borders. Decisively defeated on the battlefield, the enemies of Lukashenko's pro-Russian faction in Belarus stage a coup and oust the leader from power. In the cascading crisis, weathered Belarusian volunteers, which for years had fought in Ukraine, return home and help throw the Russians out of their homeland. Belarus thus switched sides, leaving the Russian garrison at Kaliningrad entirely surrounded by enemy forces. The Suwalki Gap is no longer a concern for the West, but it is for Russia. Over time, Poland, Lithuania, and other NATO countries pressure the Russian garrison to demilitarize. Morale sinks. They are at the whims of NATO naval forces in the Baltic, Swedish missiles on the neighboring island of Gotland, and all but blocked from their homeland. Putin decides the time is ripe to present NATO with a sort of final act. He invades Belarus and, hoping to regain a foothold in Eastern Europe, Putin decides to test NATO's resolve, launching an attack on the Suwalki Gap and small villages along the Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian borders. He uses Kaliningrad's Iskander missiles and naval missile corvettes to cover his advance. With the bulk of its reserve forces in Poland and Finland, Putin's forces overwhelm the unprepared NATO multinational garrison in Estonia, which is briefly forced into retreat. Russia immediately begins reinforcing its positions, bracing for the inevitable counterattack as NATO triggers Article 5. NATO's tripwire strategy to place small forward presence battalion-sized deployments in the Baltic to absorb a Russian invasion while it rushed its reserves to the front could not prevent Estonia from coming under Russian control. Latvia looks like it will hold, but only just. But once Estonia fell, all of NATO's Baltic states, supported by its European, American, and Canadian allies, converged. The West has wargamed this scenario over and over again, and Russian units immediately feel pressure from NATO's Response Force and Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, a multinational brigade on a constant state of alert. The initial surge into the Baltics is complicated by Russian missile attacks on roads, bridges, and railways. The US and NATO respond by establishing air superiority over Estonia at high risk to itself, beginning with a massive cyber attack and cruise missile strikes launched by a fleet of B-52s on Russian SAM sites that overwhelm their air defenses. Learning the lessons of the Ukraine war, NATO targets Russia's vulnerable logistics infrastructure, supplying its forward Estonian presence. Superior commercial satellites, drone technology, UAVs, electromagnetic capabilities, and next-generation precision-guided munitions fired by interoperable F-35 fighters enable NATO forces to target railway hubs supplying Putin's war in a way the Ukrainians never could. Once Russia gave up their air to NATO and the US, it was essentially game over. Kaliningrad, isolated and completely surrounded, capitulates in a matter of days. NATO continues to pour manpower and material into Estonia at a rate unmatched by Russia. Its theater assets are better maintained. It has higher morale, reinforced by a clear sense of mission. It suffers fewer casualties, a result of superior airlift capabilities and hospital facilities. It engages in full-spectrum multi-domain operations, or the simultaneous attack from sea, air, land, and cyberspace, unleashing a single symphony of violence to break down advanced defenses. It has been trained for years. Through it all, NATO member countries shoulder a fair share of the burden, thus proving the NATO concept. Russian morale breaks under a withering, round-the-clock assault. The war is over in a matter of weeks. Russian forces beat a hasty retreat to Moscow, and Putin's world comes crashing down as his people, fired up after years of disappointment, global isolation, bloodshed, and military setbacks, finally turn on him. Sure, it's all hypothetical, and yes, it's fair to claim that the West has struggled against forces far weaker than the conventional peers they would face in the Baltics over the past few decades. A fair criticism, but one equally applicable to nearly every country immersed in counterinsurgencies and irregular warfare. It's hard to believe that Russia could ever succeed in an out-and-out military confrontation against the West all on its own. If the West applies the full weight of its collective military capabilities on a clearly defined enemy, the outcome for Putin would be very, very bad indeed. His only recourse, again, would be to threaten the world with nuclear destruction. Would he really go that far? What do you think? Let us know in the comments, And don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.